Dark Memories, Fae Wilds Series, Book 9, written by W.J. May, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Dark Memories. What could be more frightening than a blood bond with a vampire? Finding out that vampires are the least of her worries, Hollie is trapped between formidable forces who want to use them in their sibling war for power. Only by deepening the bond with the dashing vamp who wants to claim her as his mate can she hope to escape. But the vamp can't do it alone. She needs all of her Fae friends to survive. The only problem is, Fae and vampire are mortal enemies. If she can't win the battle between friends, there's no way she'll win the war against worse. Prologue. The yellow light of the realm's meager moon bathed everything around him a sickly glow. To get to the entrance where he currently stood, he'd passed by hovels and shanties stacked haphazardly against a ridgeline made of burnt porous orange rock that left every surface covered with red-tinged dust. Few beings showed their faces this late in the evening, and the ones that did stuck to the shadows, scuttling around like insects who knew they were better off hidden. It didn't matter to him what this world was called. It was just another shabby realm on the rim of the known universes. Where he found himself was not important. The only thing that mattered was capturing his quarry and getting the answers he sought. He was relieved to escape the oppressive atmosphere outside when he ducked under a rock overhang in the ridgeline to enter a stone tunnel. That relief lasted about a dozen footsteps until the smell hit him. A grimace on his scarred face, he'd covered his nose, bracing himself for whatever sat at the end of the tunnel. He'd been in hostile environments before, his demon heritage ensuring his presence on various hell realms, but his years spent among the Fae had accustomed him to the air smelling pleasant and sweet. Whatever scents were roiling out of the location to which he was currently heading could never be called sweet. He had no problem adjusting to the absence of light as he made his way underground. His remaining eye could see as clearly in the dark as it could in noontime sun. It was one of the perks of his supernatural sight, but it hadn't come cheaply. The leather patch and scar tissue covering the hole where his left eye had been remained as a testament to the true cost. His entire identity was tied up in that one act of sacrifice, an act he refused to regret. It will be worth it when I finally achieve my goal. The name he'd been given by others no longer bothered him. There were worse things than being called by a defining feature. The eye knew that one day, when the depth of his sacrifice was revealed to all, the name would no longer be used in a pejorative sense. The eye is the only one who saw clearly, they'll say. I just need to find the one I seek. So far, that feat was easier wished than done. He'd tracked his prey across realm after realm, ever since he'd heard the rumor of the imp who'd been caught talking about a mysterious prince of darkness one night while in his cups. The eye had been scouring the web for any news of the prophecy and coming apocalypse, which is how he'd stumbled across the story of the mythical princess. Well, she's mythical to most everyone else, having kept herself hidden for millennia, but I know she exists, and if someone else has seen her, then that is someone I need to find, to learn the truth. He discovered that the imp was a gambler, and apparently an itinerant one at present, as he took himself from world to world, from game to game, as easily as crossing a quiet street, not even bothering to stop for sleep or a fresh pair of trousers. By the time the eye arrived on the scene, the imp had vanished with either a purse overflowing with coin or an empty one, his mood varying based on his winnings or losses. He left in his wake either grumbling players still stung by his victory or smug ones who were happy to tell a scarred stranger all about how they'd fleeced the irritated imp. Even though he could travel across the multiverse in a blink of the eye, thanks to his demonic abilities, he'd begun to grow weary of the chase. Only his zeal to see the plan he'd been fixated on for eons come to fruition kept him moving, kept him searching realm after realm for the answer he might have prayed for, if he had any respect for the gods. The rock tunnel opened up at last. The smell was just as powerful as the candle-laden chamber in front of him. It was about as wide as a standard tavern drinking floor, and a few paces past the entrance was a bar in the shape of a square. A creature with a multitude of eyes, and too many arms for the eye's comfort, blinked through the gloom at him as he approached. The thought that the beast must have arachnid ancestors would have given him chills if he'd still had the good sense to fear things. What's your pleasure? It asked, not bothering to wipe the bar clean in front of where the eye stood. And before you answer, know that we only accept currency that clinks, none that folds. As it spoke, the wavy image of a hoard of gold rising in gentle waves across the floor of a massive cavern arose above the creature's head. The demon was not startled by the image. He'd seen many such things over the millennia since his ocular sacrifice, images that had helped to guide him on his path toward the end of the multiverse. They were little glimpses of the future, scenes of significance in the bearer's life that would lead to meaningful and irrevocable changes. Ignoring the floating image, the eye shrugged in response, not planning to spend any of the coins tucked in the pouch that hung low around his neck to remain tucked out of sight behind his studded leather tunic. "I'm looking for an pistol!" The shriek cut off the demon's words, and his eyes traveled to the figure, who'd shouted loud enough to cause echoes in the underground space. His exhortation was followed by a chorus of groans from the others gathered around the oval table in the far corner of the room. The eye watched as the figure leaned in to scoop a pile of coins in his direction. Blonde hair, fine clothing, smug grin. It seems as if I've found my quarry at last. But it was the image that shimmered into place over the man's head that startled the eye, making his fists clench and his heart pound with excitement. The picture of a raven, its beady black eyes shining, its beak cracked open as if it were cawing out its doom-laden cadence of squawks, gave him chills. It was all the confirmation he needed. In an instant, the eye was at his side, close enough to make the figure start and take a step backward. "It looks like people are lining up to lose to me," the stranger said with a nod in the eye's direction. "Show me the coin, and I'll make sure to give you a head start." Laid out on the oval table was a complicated board with pieces strewn about it, all seeming to follow a path that weaved through obstacles made of abstract shapes. The eye wasn't interested in the game at all, but before he could alert his prey to the reason he'd approached, a beetle-shaped being waved its antenna fitfully, its voice coming out in a buzzing drone. "That is your 5th pistol in as many minutes. It profits no one to continue such a cursed game." At that, the beetle shambled off, followed by the rest of the creatures arrayed by the game table. The imp in human disguise laughed, shaking his head. Then he looked the eye over, a grin returning to his face. "Their loss is your gain, demon. Have a seat, and we will start the game anew." When the eye didn't move, the imp's smile slipped a little, then returned. "If you're not a fan of this game, we could play another. Dice, perhaps? Or cards, if you prefer." He answered the man's query by pulling the bag of coins from his tunic and dropping it on the table. It hit with a heavy clink, and the eye could see the other's eyes light up. "I've got a bet if you're brave enough to take it. All my coins against all of yours." The imp licked his lips, sniffing twice before the cocky grin returned to his face. "I like a man with confidence. What's the bet?" "I bet that I can guess the number you're thinking." The figure stared hard at him, his expression serious. "An interesting gamble, to be sure. And I suppose you plan to pluck the number out of my mind by telepathy?" "I am not telepathic," the eye responded, his eyes fastening on a vampire who was lurking at the bar, nursing a cup of red liquid. "But we can control for telepathy." He gestured toward the leech and saw a look of resignation on the imp's face. "Right. Vamps are resistant to telepathy, aren't they?" The imp sauntered over to the bar and said a few words to the vamp, who looked entirely disinterested until the promise of coins for his cooperation came into play. The pair returned, the imp strutting more than walking. So sure was he that the bet was already won. "I will inform our new friend here of the number I'm thinking, and he will confirm whether your guess is correct. Before I choose my number, are there any parameters you want to establish? Only numbers from 1 to 10, 1 to 100? Shrugging a shoulder, the eye shook his head. "Any number of any size will do." The imp tried to temper his smug expression then, but his struggle was evident. From the images appearing around him now, the eye could tell he thought things were well in the bag. "Too bad he's about to lose." The imp scratched his chin, then leaned over and cupped his hand over the vampire's ear, giving him the number he'd selected. The vampire nodded once when he'd finished, and both sets of eyes turned to look at the demon. The eye didn't hesitate. His abilities to see the future meant that the demon already knew what number the imp would select before he himself had. 3,417,603. Jaw dropping, the imp's face filled with disbelief. The vampire let out a gruff laugh, then bent to the table to take a portion of the pile of coins in front of his companion before the eye could claim his winnings. "There's no way you could have guessed that," the imp gasped, his eyes narrowing, "unless you've got some charm affecting your luck." The eye shrugged, then made a move as if he were coming to sweep the coins in his own direction. "Wait," the imp said, putting a hand on the pile. "Give a man a chance to get his winnings back." "You have nothing to risk. I've already won all of your coins." The eye had expected an exchange like this. A degenerate gambler wouldn't be satisfied with a quick and simple loss, so the demon had built that notion into his plan. "I have something more valuable than coin. Connections. If you win, I can get you an audience with some of the most powerful beings in the web. I'm sure a demon like you is familiar with the Archons." It was difficult for the eye not to reveal his eagerness at their mention. These Archons, who were more commonly called the Princes of Darkness. "That is an interesting offer," he said, pretending to think it over. "But are you really so sure I won't be able to guess the next number with ease?" "Only if you agreed to play fair and neutralize your luck charm." It was clear the imp believed that was how he'd been able to win, because so few creatures could see the future with any clarity. It was a natural conclusion, even if it was the wrong one in this instance. The eye decided to play along. "Fine, then," he said, his voice gruff, his expression begrudging. Reaching within his tunic, he pulled out an old compass he'd carried around for ages. It had been given to him by someone special long ago, someone whose sensual curves and playful eyes he still thought about from time to time. The last time he'd seen her, she told him in her sultry voice that he could use it to find his way whenever he was lost. He hadn't bothered to tell her that he wasn't the one who was lost. The compass still worked, but he had no use for it, his other abilities being much more beneficial for navigating the web. Still, he could tell by the way the imp was watching him carefully that the man was hooked. He would believe the compass was a luck charm long enough to make one final bet. "I will forsake the charm," the eye said, making a motion in the air as if releasing the spell. "But if you lose, you must agree to accompany me to the Archon of my choosing. Swear the oath before accepting, so I know you won't try to give me the slip." "I swear it," the imp said, gesturing dismissively. He was riding the wave of anticipation, ready to risk his freedom to win the bet. The eye nodded, and once again the imp leaned in to whisper something to the vampire. "Okay," he said when he'd straightened, jerking his chin at the demon. "Let's hear your guess." "-13.35378,463 to the 10th power." The words hung between them, and the eye could tell from the ashen expression on the imp's face that he'd guessed correctly. Then again, it wasn't a guess, since he'd seen the number hovering over the imp before he'd even spoken to the vampire. Quickly, he tucked the compass and coin purse away safely, then teleported to the imp's side, locking his hand around the man's arm like a vice. "How did you—" the imp muttered, but the rest of his words was swallowed by the whoosh of the void as the eye teleported them both away. Chapter 1. "And I thought being bitten felt good. This is amazing!" She reveled in the kiss, his lips firm against her plumper ones, his embrace warm and tight. Her inexperience with a passion that burned so hot made his erotic attack almost overwhelming, and part of her wanted to let him in, wanted to drown in the intensity of pleasure that was rocking her to her core. In all the chaos they'd faced together, Maz had become the person she could rely on most. It was a confusing thought, one she couldn't ignore despite the bliss of his kiss. Trusting the vampire with her safety hadn't come easy. So how impossible does it feel to trust him with my heart? Slowly, Hollie pulled away from him. She already regretted breaking the kiss, her lips tingling as if they missed the feeling of his. Not wanting to let the tenderness of the moment slip away, she remained close enough to smell his unique masculine scent. Her attraction to the vampire was undeniable, stronger than any she'd ever felt for another man, but she knew enough about human nature to realize that an attraction that strong could also be dangerous. Already she wanted to pull his face to hers and kiss him again. She wanted to languish in his arms, spend days learning how those lips felt pressed against every inch of her skin. Thinking those thoughts was enough to make her blush, and she looked up into those ice-blue eyes and noticed how they were filled with hunger. Hunger for me, or for my blood. Hollie looked away and took a couple of steps backward, breaking the intimacy between them. She tried to shove her disturbing thoughts away, to focus on what they'd just undergone, and what they'd be facing next. Tucking an unruly lock of hair behind her ear, Hollie let out a long breath. In that moment she felt overwhelmed, unable to focus on anything. Her hands were shaking, so she buried them in the folds of her dress. Her gaze flicked around the room, looking for a seat as her knees started to give out. The vampire was back at her side in an instant, gently supporting her and ushering her over to an antique armchair. He settled her into a seat, then went to one knee beside her. "What is it, precious?" he said softly, his eyes filled with concern. How can I answer that honestly? It feels like my life has been overrun by forces beyond my control. The people close to me get hurt, or worse. I can't protect him, just like Maz can't protect me. The vampire was powerful, even now his muscular body seeming to hum with strength, and a month ago she would have said he was the scariest being she could imagine. A lot can change in a month. They were up against things that were so next level she still had trouble wrapping her mind around their abilities. The Princes of Darkness and a mysterious woman in black who had recently revealed herself to be their sister could have crushed Hollie like an insect, and almost have destroyed the man at her side. If it hadn't been for a magical acorn provided by the Queen of the Fae herself, it would have been the end of them both. She knew the vamp that would be her mate only wanted to protect her, but in this instance, doing so was impossible. But that wouldn't keep him from trying. Still, it was a conversation she didn't want to face. He's been hurt enough already on my behalf. Trying on a watery smile, she shook her head, attempting to dismiss his concern as unwarranted. "I'm just worried about my friends. They were pretty banged up by the end." It was a true statement. Phaedra had a broken wing, and Taylor was even worse off. Cass had looked like she was about to drop from sheer exhaustion. It was a marvel that she'd even been able to create the portal that had taken them off-world. "I just pray they made it somewhere with a hospital or a healer in time." Maz gave her a gentle grin. "If I know those three, they're all patched up and already plotting how to take down the Princes of Darkness single-handedly." She knew he was trying to joke her out of her mood, and that should have left her feeling relieved, but it didn't. The weight of the threat that hung over them made it hard to breathe, let alone smile. How do we know that dysfunctional family of magical beings won't go after them? She noticed the shutters come up, closing off his expression. He gave a slow shrug of one shoulder. "It seems unlikely. Those three have more important things to worry about than chasing down a witch for hire and a couple of unruly fae. And yet, I wouldn't put it past them. So far, those three seem like the three pettiest beings in the universe. That Nevroel character hunted me down from a single strand of my hair just because we left her pocket realm a mess." His features tightened. Maz stood, running a hand through his hair and saying nothing. She took to her feet, unable to stop the words from tumbling out of her mouth. "Unless the more important things you were talking about are me and you, because that I might believe." Maz's voice was soft when he finally answered. "I know you are concerned," he said, taking a hand. "But you are safe here. No one knows about this pocket dimension. We can ride out whatever storms they're causing elsewhere in the web here, and in extreme comfort, I might add." The vampire gestured to the room around them. It was luxuriously appointed, that Hollie couldn't deny, but her accommodations didn't seem to matter in the moment, given the severity of the menace they were facing. "So you're saying we can just stay here forever and the Brothers Darkness and Sister Psycho are just going to forget about us or something?" "Forever is a long time," he said, pulling a hand to his mouth and pressing a gentle kiss to the back of it. "Eventually, we will pass out of their minds as bigger issues arise." Her expression was deadpan. "Bigger issues?" "That is the matter of an apocalypse. If what I heard was correct, that might keep them a little busy." Hollie had to work hard not to roll her eyes at his casual tone. "So you expect that we'll just be able to hide out here, through an apocalypse and everything will be just fine? Maz seemed to sense the trap in her tone. Let me show you around. Maybe once you get a look at the place, some of your worry might subside. He led her by the hand through the sitting room door and into a wide hallway lined in silk wallpaper with marble floors. Abstract works of art hung at intervals along both walls, with small tables placed here and there holding vases filled with exotic flowers and delicate glass lamps. At one end of the hall she could see a portion of curving staircase, but Maz led her in the other direction, past a couple closed doors and through an archway that revealed a large and pristine kitchen. I don't use this area myself, he told her, but you might find it of interest. Hollie nodded at the reminder that he wasn't human like her. I suppose he has no use for a kitchen, which is a shame because this one is fabulous. The counters were a darker stone surface than the others, flecked with lighter colored veins that created a pleasant contrast. The cabinets that lined the walls were dark as well, and the usual appliances were all present. 6-burner stove with a massive oven, check. Large basin sink, check. Dishwasher, I think. The differently shaped cabinet next to the stove didn't look like any dishwasher she'd seen, but its placement made her think that was its use. The only thing we're missing is... No refrigerator? She said out loud to her host. Maz grinned and stepped over to a large cabinet that she'd assumed would be a pantry. It isn't a refrigerator exactly, he said as he pulled the cabinet door open, his accent stumbling over the English word in a way that let her know it wasn't a word he said regularly. The previous owner had it installed. Had most of this installed, actually. To be honest, I don't spend much time here. Inside the cabinet, things got even more confusing. The interior of the cabinet consisted solely of one barren shelf. It's empty, she said, confused. Did someone forget to do his shopping? His expression said he knew she was teasing him. That's right, he said, gesturing as if he'd forgotten something. The vampire moved to an upper cabinet nearby and pulled out a plate, then a bowl, and last a ceramic mug. Here, he said, holding the plate out to her. Put that on the shelf inside the food dispenser. She took the plate and stepped up to the empty cabinet that was still standing open beside him. Hollie placed it inside, unsure of what to expect. There was a brief flash of light, and suddenly the plate she'd placed inside was full of chocolate chip cookies. What? She called, reaching inside to pick up a cookie. They're still warm from the oven. Unable to help herself, she shoved the cookie into her mouth and chewed in rapture. The last time she'd eaten had been back at Gresh's workshop, and she had no idea how many hours had passed between then and now. How did you do that? She said around bites. Cookies on demand? That's the kind of magical tech that I'd give a limb for. Maz chuckled. It's not just cookies. Whatever you're most hungry for in the moment will appear. You don't even have to think about it. Really? She said after swallowing down the first cookie. You're saying the dispenser somehow knows whatever it is I want to eat. Maz nodded, removing the plate of cookies and setting it on the cabinet. He then handed her the bowl. Try again. See what happens. She did what he said, and a moment later there was a steaming bowl of soup. Is that chicken and dumplings? Her eyes widened in awe. At the same moment her stomach let out a fierce growl. Scooping up a spoonful, she blew on it before placing it in her mouth. Eyes closed, Hollie allowed herself a moment to savor a taste she'd been missing for years. That's my mother's recipe. I would swear it on a stack of Bibles. Maz stood patiently while she finished off the bowl and half the cookies. Then he watched as she put in the cup to end up with a mug of cold milk, then another plate of food. This time a stack of fried cheese curds, which she gobbled down with a swiftness that would have been embarrassing if she wasn't too hungry to care. This thing is amazing. I'm glad you like it, he said, closing the cabinet, placing the dishes in the machine beside the sink. But the kitchen isn't the only nice spot in the house. Let me give you the full tour. Hollie followed him back into the hall, where he opened the closed doors to reveal a well-appointed powder room and a library that stretched up to the second floor. A spiral staircase made of wrought iron twisting its way up to a second floor that was comprised of a square of walkways filled with more shelves. The center was open, giving the wood-paneled room a less oppressive feel. When they walked in, the fireplace winked to life, giving the space a warm glow. "I've spent many a contented afternoon reading here," he said, pointing to a comfortable-looking brown leather sofa in front of the fire. It did look cozy, she had to admit to herself, and Hollie started to wonder if maybe Maz's idea of sticking around here a while wasn't all bad. "It isn't a while," her inner voice reminded her. "He's talking forever, and that's a very different timeline for you than it is for him." Ignoring that voice, she followed him up the stairs and through the door into another lovely decorated hall. The first door led to the most opulent bathroom she'd ever seen, with a tub that was big enough to be a small pool and a walk-in shower that took up almost the same size footprint. The bathroom was followed by a couple of guest rooms and a massive suite with a bed covered in a collection of white furs. This was clearly the vampire's bedroom. The space was lighter than she would have expected, the large windows providing an irresistible view. Maz seemed to notice her interest and led her to a glass door which opened onto a balcony that lined the entire side of the house there. It was night outside, but not pitch black, the stars above them providing ample light to see by. She looked up into a sky more purple than black, dotted with constellations that were larger than she was used to. "It looks like you could reach up and pluck a star out of the sky," she whispered to herself. Maz heard her, no doubt thanks to his supernatural hearing. He grinned, nodding. "I paid a pretty penny for those stars. I did not want to be subjugated to the white void that used to encircle this estate." "You ordered these stars? Like out of a catalog or something?" The thought that someone could purchase the night sky was mind-boggling to Hollie. "Something like that. I hired a design team to renovate the entire realm. Sorceresses who were able to create a spell for me remotely to unlock once I was in the realm. That was the only way I could fix up the place without simultaneously letting others into it." "It's nice," she murmured after a moment, taking in the expansive grounds. There was a lovely garden that she could see in the distance, beyond a fountain large enough to be an in-ground pool and a patio with comfortable seating just below the balcony. Beyond the garden, trees rose up to create a natural border that seemed to go on forever, along with the sky. "Could I do it?" she asked herself. "Could I stay here with him forever, never seeing anyone else, just spending my life with him and the malfunctioning robot that somehow contains the shade of my dead father in its mechanical innards?" Not long ago, she would have said the entire situation was preposterous, but given what she'd been through, a handful of decades spent in peace and quiet didn't sound so bad. She wandered back inside, her eyes going to the plush bed, her mind wandering to the hours they could spend there, learning one another's bodies. "What do you say?" Maz said, moving closer, his hands sliding up her arms to rest lightly on her shoulders. "We could make a go of it. Try to find a measure of happiness together." Hollie had to admit, the idea was growing on her, but before she could respond, a sound like the ripping of fabric echoed through the room. Maz instantly turned to face the noise, tucking her safely behind him and baring his fangs at whatever had interrupted their conversation. It wasn't fabric that was ripping, she realized then, but reality itself. A hole was being formed in the space a few feet in front of them, and through that hole stepped a figure that made the spark of hope she just felt vanish. The hole closed behind the Angel of Death as he crossed his arms and stared at the pair of them. Chapter 2. "So, this is where you got off to." Samael took a look around the room, his expression saying he wasn't impressed with his surroundings. "How did you find us?" Maz growled. Shock was broadcasting from his features. He truly believed they were safe. Hollie knew, but it seemed his master had been underestimated. "Every inch of this realm has been covered in enough hexes to obliterate anyone trying what you just did. And yet, here I am, still intact." Samael straightened the sleeves of his tailored suit jacket and looked down his nose at them. "But you two are in a spot of difficulty, aren't you?" "You never should have been able to find us," Maz insisted, but his master waved away his protests. "Yes, you hid this place very well, But you forgot one thing. Samael approached the vampire, his expression turning wild. I own you. He pressed a finger into Maz's broad chest. That means I know everything about you. His feral gaze flicked to Hollie, and cold filled her insides. Including the fact that you've found your mate. Maz started, his eyes narrowing at the same time that every one of his muscles tightened, as if he were getting ready to pounce. Did your brother spill the beans? He asked, his tone lacking any respect for the more powerful being confronting him. No one spilled the beans, Samael replied, irritation evident in his voice. I told you, I know everything. Each word was accentuated with another poke to the vampire's chest. On the last word, Maz made to slap the finger away, but his hand stopped a millimeter before it could make contact. She could see the vampire struggling to move his arm, but it soon returned to his side, limp. The angel of death smiled. When you own a thing, you can control it. What do you want with us? Maz snarled, his fangs on full display. I must say, I'm a little disappointed in my reception. I would have expected more hospitality from my right-hand leech. He sniffed, not bothering to hide his irritation. Hollie couldn't believe his rudeness, barging in and behaving how he was. Then again, he was one of the most powerful beings to ever live. She couldn't imagine the level of entitlement that fact might breed. Still, exasperated at his actions on Nyx, Hollie opened her mouth to tell the Archon off. Before she could, the world went sideways. Everything blurred with sickening speed, and she found herself seated in a plush chair looking out over the giant fountain she'd seen from the balcony above. Hollie blinked, realizing Samael must have transported them there. Maz was already back on his feet, springing up from his seat beside her and placing himself between her and the Angel of Death, who was sitting in another chair, one leg bent and resting on the other, a pair of sunglasses having appeared on his face. I guess I don't need these, he said airily, and the glasses disappeared. What do you want? Maz said, his voice low and vibrating with intensity. She could see anger in the lines of his body and his stiff expression, but she knew that his fear must be just as great, if not greater. Hollie could see how the vampire was struggling, and her heart went out to him. It couldn't be easy, confronting a boss who could crush him with a snap of his ancient fingers, not to mention that Samael had taken the place of a surrogate parent to Maz when he was younger. As screwed up and toxic as their relationship was, it wasn't like the vampire could quit and go his own way. She knew that Samael wouldn't make things that simple. What happened with your siblings? Hollie asked, attempting to diffuse some of the tension that seemed to be growing between Maz and his master. That must have been some argument, and yet you seem to have survived it with your sense of humor intact. Samael's eyes met hers and flashed red, their color making her stomach churn. You know how sibling rivalries can be. We might fight from time to time, but deep down, we're still a family. Remind me not to join you all for Thanksgiving dinner, Hollie muttered in response, but Samael ignored her remark, either because he wasn't interested in what she was saying or he had no familiarity with the holiday. His attention returned to Maz, who hadn't moved an inch. That was a neat trick you pulled on Nyx, he said, a note of heat in his tone. You should have known that I wouldn't let you be seriously hurt. That was why I kept you out of the way like I did. Out of the way, Hollie said, hopping from her seat and moving around the vamp, too filled with indignation to stay back like she should. You stuck him right above the dais and let him get hit with lightning like it was nothing. A whoosh, and a second later, Hollie found herself back in her seat. I wish he would stop doing that. Then you took off without a second thought, not bothering to check on the damage you might have done to your poor, unfortunate master. Ha! She was up again, her finger wagging at the Archon. You seem no worse for wear, and besides, you deserve everything Maz gave you and more. Your family was fighting over me like a pack of dogs with a bone. Precisely, Samael said, his attention on her again. Hollie noticed twin tendrils of smoke starting to twist out of his nostrils and take to the air. The scent of sulfur surrounded her, and she felt a whiff of fear. And my assistant here had the audacity to spirit you away, no doubt thinking he'd be hidden in this hovel. An assistant that can't be trusted to act in his master's best interest is no longer worthy of serving, nor of the protection his master can offer. Protection? This came from Maz. He gently pulled Hollie to his side, his hand taking hers. Is that what you've offered me for all these years? Taking me from my people, from my mother, and turning me into this monster? That's what you call protection? The Angel of Death scowled up at the vamp, the whites of his eyes bleeding to red, the pupils vanishing into them so that the entirety of his eyes was the same sickening sheen. "I wasn't aware you held such hostility for the person who gave you everything, including your miserable eternal life. So much for gratitude, I suppose." "Then let's call it even," Maz suggested. "Part company now. You've had millennia of loyal service, more than enough to pay back the gifts you've given me." The vampire's tone was light, but there was hidden steel beneath. Hollie held her breath, wondering whether Samael would even consider Maz's words. For a moment his expression seemed genuine. "My disappointment in you this moment knows no bounds, but we'll address that later. As much as I've enjoyed our little conversation, I have things to attend to. Let's get down to brass tacks. I'm here for the human." "You can forget that," Maz snarled, his rage unleashed. He took a step forward, his mouth opening to tell off his master, but no words came out. He was frozen, his muscles unable to move. Hollie held what suddenly felt like a lifeless hand. She looked up into his face, noticing that his eyes could still move as they met hers, but otherwise he was stuck. Samael stood, straightening his suit before stepping forward. "Save your protests," he said, patting Maz on his cheek in a patronizing way. "They won't matter in the slightest. This is bigger than you, bigger than your mate." The way he said the last word made it clear to Hollie that he held the concept in low regard. "My sister wants her, which means she's important. More important than all of this," he finished, motioning toward the pair. "Let him go," Hollie insisted, holding on tighter to Maz's arm. "He deserves a little civility after all he's done for you." "I can't do that, sweetheart," Samael responded. "This whole matehood hoax is screwing with his head. He's never going to be able to sit still and listen, not while he thinks you're in danger. And he's not wrong. You are definitely in danger." "Why me?" Hollie said, her exasperation and desperation warring for dominance. "I'm the opposite of important." "That's a riddle I still have to solve, and I will. But for now, it's more critical to secure you and figure things out later. I'm not the only one looking for you." "You don't want your sister to have me," Hollie said, stating the obvious. "But you don't seem to understand. She doesn't want me, not really. She thinks I'm involved in some plot with you and your brother, but it's really all a big misunderstanding." "I'm sure," the Angel of Death said, his expression betraying the opposite. "Still, better safe than sorry." "I'm serious," Hollie insisted. "She thinks—" Samael cut her off with a sweep of his hand. "We can chat all about this later. Right now, I need to make certain your location isn't discovered. Your leverage, of whatever sort, and that's all that matters." "How did it get this way?" Hollie said, not bothering to hide the pity in her voice. "You're siblings, and yet you were basically trying to kill one another on Nyx. That's not how families behave." She was squeezing Maz's hand as she spoke, hoping that whatever delay she could manage would allow him to break the spell he was under and move again. She thought she felt a small twinge in response and tried to keep the hope she now felt off her face. "Heavy are the heads that wear the crowns, aren't they? We're under pressures a mortal like you couldn't understand." Samael's tone was dismissive. 5 princes of darkness created by Shaitan to do his bidding, and 1 princess, fair and devious, manifested as a mate for his only begotten son. His expression took up a faraway expression. "She could have been the queen of the multiverse, ruling by her husband's side for eternity. Instead, she's prophesied to be the bringer of the great annihilation, the one who will banish the adversary of old, a.k.a. our creator, from the web for all time." "Sounds serious," Hollie said, not bothering to tell him that she'd heard it all before, back on Valencia. "But it still has nothing to do with me." "I haven't seen my sister since we were much younger beings. If she's showing up now, that means something. And since you're the one that has prompted her reappearance, there is no way I'm letting you out of my sight." He reached out to her, and that's when she felt Maz squeeze her hand hard and true. Then they were gone, whooshing away into darkness. Chapter 3. "Where are we?" Hollie said, blinking into darkness before a lamp blazed to life above them. The walls around them were stone, the floor dirt. There were shapes covered in drop cloths and wooden crates stacked haphazardly around them. "The storage cellar beneath the mansion," Maz said, looking around frantically. "I didn't want to take us from the estate. At least here there's only one Archon who knows where we are. If we leave my pocket dimension, we'll be vulnerable to the other two. And if they've told the rest of the princes about us—" His words trailed off. He looked down at her, his face full of concern. "I still don't know how Samael found us here. It should have been impossible. If this whole thing has taught me anything, it's that nothing is impossible." The impossible had become too real to Hollie during her time since leaving Earth on this crazy adventure. She knew the vamp was doing his best to keep her safe, but she couldn't lay the blame for Samael at his feet. Maz nodded, his expression caught between a grin and a grimace. "I suppose I was naive to believe we could hole up here and avoid the endless conflict. I'm afraid bringing you down here was a reflex, and one that Samael will figure out before too long. I have no idea how to extract you from this situation. I'm sorry." "You never were known for your creative thinking," a voice said, and Hollie held in a groan. She whirled around to see the Angel of Death behind them, leaning against the wall with a bored expression on his handsome face. She could feel Maz bristling beside her, and a wild light came into his eyes. One moment he was beside her, his hand still in hers. The next he was shoving his fist into the Archon's face. Unfortunately, instead of hitting Samael, the punch rebounded at the last second, Maz's fist driving itself into his own face, a spray of blood issuing from his nose. Hollie's hands covered her eyes, and she peeked between her fingers as the vampire kept at it, trying to find a way to strike the Angel of Death. Every blow rebounded until Maz looked like a madman beating himself up. "Stop it!" she called out, hating to see him in pain. Maz hung his head and stopped trying to attack his master. He turned to look in Hollie's direction, a resigned expression on his face. "Do you always do what your mate tells you?" Samael asked, irritation rife in his tone. He took a couple steps in Hollie's direction, one blonde eyebrow cocked. "Not that I can blame you, I suppose. I know how tough the matehood bond can be to override." Hands behind his back, the Archon paced around them. "Still, it does hurt a little, knowing you'll jump to obey her when once you showed such deference to the one who made you what you are." Maz's eyes were on his master, but he didn't answer. He only stared at him, raw rage in his gaze. "I'm surprised he's not burning Samael to a crisp where he stands with that look alone," Hollie thought. The Angel of Death turned his attention to her. "He would do anything for you, do you know that? He practically can't help himself. Anything you want from him, he'll give you." Samael was close enough for her to reach out and touch now. Not that Hollie would want to. His voice dropped to a near whisper, and he leaned in toward her in an intimate fashion that was very unsettling. "Isn't such power intoxicating?" She turned away, rubbing her arms at the chill that went through her. "Maybe to some types," she muttered. "Not to me." Samael let out a low chuckle. "Is that so? You're immune to it, eh?" Hollie found herself turning back in his direction, but it wasn't something she did herself. An invisible force was turning her around and bringing her closer to the Archon once again. "You must truly be special. No wonder my sister is so interested in you." She could tell from his tone that he was being sarcastic. Maz let out a low growl. "Leave her out of our disagreement. It has nothing to do with her." "Doesn't it?" Samael snapped, the mask holding back his anger slipping. "You mean to tell me that after millennia of excellent service, you decided on your own to betray me?" The Angel of Death clicked his tongue disapprovingly. "You might be able to lie to yourself, Leech, but not to me." Hollie could see that their adversary was running out of patience. She worried that if they continued their verbal sparring, they might push him over the edge. "It's not so much that he's lying to himself," she said in a light-hearted tone. "It's that he's admitting the truth." "The truth?" Samael said, looking skeptical. Hollie put on the ditzy tone she'd hidden behind before in times of duress with people who were older or wiser or more powerful. She twirled a lock of hair around her finger and cocked her head. "My dad used to say that he figured out after a few years of living together that my mother was always right. He then decided it was easier to just listen to her rather than to fix the mistakes he made by not listening to her." She'd meant her statement to be humorous, to break some of the tension that was starting to make her feel like a potato in a pressure cooker, only a moment away from imploding. Samael, however, seemed to see it as a challenge. This guy has a chip on his shoulder bigger than the Statue of Liberty. I can't decide which is cuter, Samael said, his eyes like slits. Your stupid simpering persona or the fact that you might think I believe you. That whatever is going on between you and my possession is important enough to me to care about any of this. Maz jumped him then so quickly that at first Hollie wasn't certain what had happened. The vamp leapt on Samael's back, digging dark claws into his shoulder and driving his fangs into the Archon's neck. Hollie skittered backward until she could feel the cold stone wall at her back, her eyes wide. She couldn't tear them away from what was happening before her. The instant Maz's fangs penetrated, Samael's skin turned the same red as his eyes, and Maz fell off him, fangs and claws releasing. The vamp hit the floor hard and rolled over, pulling himself to his knees just in time to let loose a stream of foul-smelling black vomit. It pooled around him, thick as tar, steaming as it sank into the dirt floor. Maz heaved, his entire body racked by cramps, and Hollie clutched her chest, wondering whether to rush forward and attempt to soothe him. Samael had other plans, however. He seemed to grow until he was twice what he'd been before. Turning, he looked down on the vamp with eyes that had become open flames. You dared to drink from me? From me! The foundations of the mansion shook around them, dust and small debris raining down from the ceiling. Samael circled his minion, derision dripping from his words. I have smitten creatures greater and more consequential than you, leech, for much less than the indignity you thought I would suffer at your hands. I should end you where you lie. No one needs to end anyone, Hollie croaked, deciding to risk interfering. Like you said, it's the mating frenzy. He's not in his right mind. It didn't feel good agreeing with Samael, especially on this particular point. But the only thing she could think of was making sure Maz wasn't immolated before her eyes. Let's all just take a break and catch our breaths. Idiotic humans, Samael grumbled, always thinking they can solve something by focusing on their breathing. Despite the disdain in his tone, the Archon shrank back to his original size, some of the anger seeming to bleed out of him. Maz, however, was not as easily convinced. He'd managed to make him back to his feet, but his face was wan, and he looked sicker than she'd ever seen him. From the heat in his eyes, she knew it was only a matter of time before he tried to attack Samael again. Hang on now, she told him, holding a hand up. We're going around in circles here, and resorting to violence isn't going to solve our issue. There has to be some sort of compromise. Men like Samael don't compromise, Maz croaked, his eyes shooting to the Archon. A grin appeared on Samael's face. You know me so well, Leech, but for once I agree with your human. Compromise seems the most expedient solution to our little problem. So let me make you a more palatable offer. The human comes with me, the being best suited to protect her against my sister and her followers, and in exchange, I agree not to erase your existence after the little stunt you just pulled. No deal, Maz snarled, his fangs flashing again. He was a moment away from attacking Samael again, Hollie knew. So she did the only thing she could think of. She agreed. I'll take that deal, she said, her hand shooting up in the air. I'll go with you, and in exchange, you promise not to harm Maz in any way, ever. Two sets of angry eyes turned in her direction, and Hollie swallowed hard past the knot in her throat. Oh boy, what have I done now? Chapter 4. A moment later, Hollie was blinking into the starlit confines of Maz's bedroom. The vampire had sent up a howl of anger, then grabbed her, bringing them back to their starting point. What did you do? He groaned, clutching her arms tightly. You can't make a bargain with the devil like that. What choice do we have? She argued back. We aren't going to be able to avoid him, and he could kill you as easily as look at you. She's right, you know. Samael was leaning against the wall, examining his own fingernails with a bold expression on his face. In fact, I don't even have to look at you to destroy you. Maz whirled on his master, and for a second, Hollie was sure he would try to continue the physical fight against the much stronger being. Instead, he surprised her. It appears my human guest and I are at odds on this matter. His voice came out sounding cultured and polite, as if he was speaking to an invited guest at a dinner party. Perhaps you could excuse us for a short private discussion? It looked for a moment like the Archon might laugh, but he nodded instead and made his way to the door. "Don't take too long, leech." He disappeared, closing the bedroom door behind him. "You do not know what you've agreed to," Maz told her once they were alone. "That kind of agreement has no limits. You'll be in Samael's care, and I've already told you how he treats those entrusted to him." Hollie knew he was talking about his own childhood experiences after his mother had given her to Samael as a sacrifice intended to deliver her people from a plague. What the vampire had gone through was enough to make Hollie detest the Archon for eternity, and her heart went out to him. Her tone softening, she walked into his arms. He enfolded her, pulling her head into his chest and placing his cheek on the top of her head. "I know how you feel," she told him, "and I'm not agreeing to things lightly. I'm not expecting 5-star treatment from that creature. It's just that there aren't any other options, are there?" "There have to be," he insisted. "I've seen others who made a deal with Samael. None have come out as they expected." "So there's some sort of trick involved is what you're saying," Hollie said, biting her lip. "Some way that Samael will take advantage of us by honoring the word of the pact, but not the spirit of it." "He will not treat your agreement as anything more than empty words in its current form." Maz ran a hand through his hair, looking thoroughly irritated. "You can't make a Prince of Darkness honor their word. They've built kingdoms on lies for generations." "A vow, then," Hollie replied, remembering what the imp Dallin had insisted on from Ahriman in order to complete their exchange. "An eternal, unbreakable vow. We make him swear one." Maz put his hands on his temples. "A vow is a start, since it will actually hold him to his promise. But even a vow isn't a foolproof guarantee. Besides, a vow requires witnesses." As if on cue, the door to the bedroom opened and Wendy floated in on his jets. "I'm sure you're already aware of this, given the commotion we've been hearing," said the robot. "But Prince Samael is in the library making quite a mess." "Just admiring your collection," came the prince's voice, echoing down the hallway. "The longer I'm left alone, the bigger the mess will become, I suppose." Hollie's eyes closed in exasperation. Pinching the bridge of her nose, she tried to keep their conversation on track. "Witnesses we have. Wendy here will be an excellent witness, and my father is a notary public, so you couldn't ask for much better." "I don't have my stamp," her father said from inside the robot. "But my signature is still valid. What do you need witnesses for, sweetheart?" "Your daughter wants to make a deal with the devil out there," Maz said, his tone annoyed. "Maybe you can talk some sense into her." "Isn't he one of the three who were attempting to rip each other to pieces?" Frank asked, confused. "I don't think that's a good idea, Hollie." "I'm out of ideas, Dad." She tried to keep her frustration out of her voice. "I figured it made sense to ask one of the three to keep us safe from the other two. Aren't you the one who always says that sometimes you just have to make a decision? That in the choose-your-own-adventure version of your life, sometimes you pick the wrong ending?" "Yes, but that assumes you can just go back and pick another one," her father said gently. "I think this is a little different situation. You have to be careful when choosing the lesser of two evils." "There is no greater evil than Samael," Maz cut in. "He could give Shayatin himself a run for his money." The sound of something falling over elsewhere in the house rang out down the hall, and Hollie let out a groan. Samael wasn't going to wait forever. "Look, I get it, okay? We don't exactly have another choice. It's Samael or nothing. So maybe we give your boss a second chance, at least until we can figure out a better one." Maz shook his head again, and her heart sank. She approached once again, taking both his hands into her own. "I can't watch him hurt you like that again," she said softly. "I won't watch him murder you in front of me. Once he makes the vow, he won't be able to do that. He'll have to let us alone." "He's never going to let us alone, Dumpling," Maz said, his tone low. "He knows you're my mate, and that is something he'll never abide." Hollie threw her hands up. "What's that even about? It shouldn't have any bearing on the discussion." Maz looked at her for a moment, and she could see the debate on his features. Whatever he was about to say, she could tell he didn't want to share. "Samael lost his own mate eons ago, before I was brought to Pluto. The rumors and stories I've heard about it are conflicting, so all I know for certain is that she died under mysterious circumstances. Some say a rival killed her. others that she took her own life. A few even maintain that Samael himself did the deed, although I find that unlikely. Killing one's mate like that should be impossible. He let out a ragged breath, and Hollie held her own, waiting for the words he didn't want to come out. In any event, he changed after that, turned against matehood entirely. Like a bitter divorcee who suggests marriage is a sham. Hollie didn't understand why his opinions on the subject mattered, and said as much. It matters because Samael expects his minions to share his opinion, Maz clarified. He does not allow any of his servants to have mates. But isn't matehood involuntary to some races? She asked, confused. So, how can he... Her words trailed off because Hollie thought she knew the answer, but even when Maz confirmed it, she didn't want to believe it. What happens to those mates? The ones he doesn't allow his servants to have? Maz shook his head without answering, but she could read the truth in his eyes. A sudden cold anger filled her. He must have known this before even meeting me, which means that he pursued me despite knowing that Samael would never allow it. How long did you think you could hide this little tidbit of information from me? She asked, her tone harsh. All this time we've been together, and I've been in danger of getting caught by your boss? I wouldn't have allowed that to happen, Maz said stiffly. I was keeping you out of his range, keeping us under wraps. Great job, she replied sardonically. You somehow thought you could keep that kind of information from your boss. No wonder Dallin thought he could trade me to Auermon to get out from under Samael's thumb. He knew what Samael would do if he knew about me, and therefore I could be used as a bargaining chip between the brothers. What could I do? Meeting one's mate is life-changing. I could not ignore the need inside me, the instinct to claim you. I would risk everything to be with you. And you have. The words hung between them as hurt racked her. I can't believe you kept this from me. Once again, you proved to me that I can't trust you. I was trying to protect you, he said, putting finger under her chin to lift her gaze to his. You are the most important thing in the multiverse to me, and I would not allow Samael to harm you. And yet here we are. She knew it wasn't the vampire's fault, but that did little to assuage the anger inside her. It's obvious that you can't protect me. You can't even protect yourself, not against Samael. Her words hurt him, she could tell, but it was time for one of them to make the tough decision. The only decision. We don't have a choice, she said again, and turned and walked away. Through the open door, she called out to Samael, and a second later he appeared in front of her. We're willing to make the agreement with you, provided you make an unbreakable vow that you will not harm either of us, and you cannot lay a finger on your servant. Samael crossed his arms, his eyes lighting up. I've got to admit it, Leech. Your mate is smarter than you are. He moved past her to enter the room, and Hollie followed. I'll make your vow, human, he told her once he'd reached the center of the room. And I'll even let you choose the wording. Then you can't come back to me later to whine about what you agreed to. It must include the stipulation that Hollie and I cannot be forcibly separated, Maz piped up, his voice like iron, letting them know he wouldn't back down on that point. Fine, Hollie said stiffly, then went back to ignoring the vampire. Knowing that Samael wanted to appear generous, but still not trusting the evil creature, she turned to Wendy, hoping the bot would hear her ace in the hole. Crouching beside him to be dome level, she put a hand on the bot's shoulder. Could you help create the wording of an ironclad vow that keeps us safe? A cascade of lights went off in the robot's dome, and it took a moment before he responded. I believe I can be of assistance. Please give me a few moments to make some calculations. Samael wandered over to stare out the window while the bot considered the appropriate wording for the vow. Hollie remained nearby, ignoring the vampire, who was hovering close, clearly still upset. After a moment, her father piped up. That's good, but you're forgetting to calculate the odds of accidental mishap. Wendy let out an irritated beep. Please do not monitor my calculations, sir. It's distracting. My apologies, but I don't exactly have a choice now that we're sharing a brain, Frank replied. And I've been in insurance for decades, which means I know a little bit about risk calculations. The two of them continued their discussion until the Archon put a fingernail, now sharp as a razor, against the window and drew it down, creating a sound like nails on a chalkboard, but somehow worse. I'm running short on patience, he reminded them in a sing-song voice. Either give me a vow to swear to, or I'll leave you to my sister and whatever tortures she's got in store for you. We are ready, Wendy announced, then rehearsed the wording for them. Hollie nodded along, impressed at the paragraph that said she would agree to accompany Samael if he vowed to keep from harming them mentally, physically, or emotionally, while also actively preventing others from doing the same. When he finished wording it off, Samael stepped forward, annoyed. Fine, he said. I do so swear. He lifted a hand, palm out, then motioned toward Hollie. She looked in Maz's direction. The vampire shook his head, a frown on his features. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward to put her hand against his and spoke the words. I do so swear. A bright green glow appeared around their joined hands, weaving what looked like dozens of ropes made of light around them. Those ropes then sank into their skin and disappeared, leaving behind a cool tingle like an evening breeze. Please don't let me be making a huge mistake. Chapter 5. The gloom of Pluto's eternal night reflected his own feelings back at him. Maz's insides matched the conditions around him, gray and bleak. And hopeless. He avoided looking at the woman at his side. He knew she was doing the same thing to him. He could feel her anger vibrating through the bond between them, a bond she wasn't aware of yet. Another live emission. How long until she finds out and things get worse than they already are? Maz wasn't certain things could be worse. His plan to keep her safe in his pocket dimension had failed almost immediately, and she wasn't wrong about his ability to protect her being sorely lacking. He was a powerful being in his own right, but next to Samael, he was a candle and the Archon was the sun. Still, it stung. But worse than all of that, worse than having Hollie mad at him, worse than the humiliation of failing to protect her was the fear that refused to leave his gut. The fear that Samael would find a way around the intricate vow Wendy and Frank had pulled together and vanish with Hollie, or find a way to hurt her. Maz cared nothing about what happened to himself. He would be disappointed at the missed opportunity of loving a remarkable human, but he would willingly sacrifice himself 1,000,000 times over if it meant that Hollie remained safe and unharmed. Samael was a snake, and it was only a matter of time before the snake struck. After agreeing to the vow, Samael had snapped his fingers, and the four of them had appeared within familiar stone walls. Pluto, back again to this cursed realm in the Prince's Keep. Back again to my prison, perhaps for the final time. I trust you can show your lady love to your quarters, leech, he'd said, already distracted. Make certain she stays put while I handle a few things, won't you? Then the angel of death had vanished, leaving him and Hollie alone with the gulf of awkwardness and pain that was growing between them. I can't believe that crazy guy made such a big deal out of getting us here, and now he disappears as soon as we arrive. This was from Frank, whose voice coming out of the robot was still something Maz was adjusting to. How can he trust you to obey his orders now? The vampire tried not to let the despair he felt enter his tone. He knows I will do nothing that might make Hollie break the vow between them. What happens if I break the vow? She asked then, for the first time. It's better you do not ask that, he replied, holding back on telling her she should have been more worried about that before agreeing to it in the first place. All his comment earned him was Hollie rolling her eyes and muttering under her breath. Because of his supernatural hearing, he could make out every word. He wasn't sure what a Weisenheimer was or why his pants should be smart, but he kept silent, figuring it wasn't worth earning even more of her ire. This way, he said, motioning toward a narrow hallway off the broader central corridor. It wound up a short flight of stairs, then ended in front of a plain wooden door. Maz pressed his hand to the door's surface to push it open, wondering about the last time he'd bothered to actually pass through the door by opening it and walking through, as opposed to just traveling from one spot to the other in the blink of an eye. Might as well give them the whole tour, he figured, since they're likely to be seeing a whole lot of this place in the days to come. Maz didn't want to think about how long they might be stuck on Pluto. He was old, ancient by any standard, but he was still a newborn in comparison to the Archons and Shayatin himself. Depending on how long this sibling tiff went on, they could still be on Pluto when the star that Earth revolved around burned out. The door opened. Maz led them inside, then closed the door behind him, knowing that only his hand could open it again. or Samael, since this realm and everything in it belonged to him. Turning to face the chamber, he realized it looked much as he'd left it centuries ago, when he'd grown tired of being so close to the Archon and his plotting, and found a dwelling among the ruins surrounding the keep. The wall curved in a half circle, the area taking up much of the tower it was a part of. High above them were wooden rafters decorated in cobwebs, and Maz made a mental note to get a few kobolds in to spruce up the place. Heavy drapery in black and red velvet hung from the rafters against obsidian walls. Plush furnishings in the same shades were interspersed among surfaces clattered in candles, skulls, and other Gothic knickknacks. But the centerpiece of the room was a circular bed with red satin sheets. Hollie walked toward the bed, picking up a pair of manacles that were attached to the baseboard, a delicate eyebrow arching in distaste. "What is this place?" she asked, her nose wrinkling. "It looks like some sort of vampire bordello." "These are my quarters, assigned to me by Samael once I had proven myself to be a loyal servant." He ran a finger along the petal of a black rose that sat in a vase of dozens of its kin, marveling that it was still the same as it had been that day millennia ago when Samael had showed him the space and expected his fawning gratitude. It was Samael's idea of a joke, these furnishings, Maz had come to learn. It was a play on vampiric stereotypes among other races, but its irony was not appealing to Maz himself. "My pocket realm is a much more accurate picture of my actual tastes," he added, not wanting his mate to think he'd choose such garish furnishings on his own. "The room was already furnished when assigned to me, and the manacles are only for show." "Sure," Hollie said, dropping the iron ring she'd been holding, a shiver going through her. "So this is where we're supposed to stay?" She didn't look happy at the prospect. "For now, yes. It's safer for you to be tucked away somewhere where I know others can't bother you. Samael might be the worst threat in the realm, but he wasn't the only one. I'm sure you can be comfortable here for now while I go discuss long-term arrangements with our host." "You're leaving?" she cried, incredulous. "We just got here." She looked around, rubbing her arms in a motion he'd come to learn was a way to soothe herself. "Fine," she said after a moment, her tone saying it was anything but. "Take off. I don't care. I could use a break from you anyway." His mate instincts were screaming at him, telling him to take her into his arms, comfort her, kiss her until the rift between them was healed. But Maz knew she would only reject him and push him away. He needed to speak to Samael alone, without Hollie around to remind his master what he'd kept hidden from him. His loyalty before now had always been unquestioned. It was time to see if it had earned him any leeway with his notoriously inflexible boss. "I'll be back soon." He was about to teleport away when he froze for a moment, knowing it was better to make things clear to her rather than leave without discussing it. Maz was discovering that he had a lot to learn when it came to being a good mate. His life before now had been entirely independent, focused mainly on doing his master's bidding, dirty work that had left him jaded and cruel. But his mate's revelation had changed him fundamentally, and he wanted to show Hollie that he was capable of being the kind of man she wanted. "The door is equipped with a locking mechanism that can only be operated by myself or on Samael's own orders. You'll be safe here." He hesitated, not wanting to admit the next part, but Wendy beat him to the punch. "Presumably that means it can only be unlocked by the same means, and therefore we are unable to open the door ourselves," the bot asked. Hollie crossed her arms, his cheeks turning red. "Oh, heck no. I've cut you a lot of slack, Vamp, but I'm not letting you lock me in here with no means of escape." He held up his arms in a sign of surrender. "I will speak to Samael about reconfiguring the lock to allow you to come and go freely. I do not have the power to change it myself." "Sure you don't," she grumbled, her tone letting him know that her trust in him was diminishing by the minute. "I've got to fix that. But first, I've got to handle Samael. He's the priority if one ranks by danger." "I'll be back as soon as I can," he said, giving her a small grin, one she failed to return. Instead, she turned her back on him and stared at the drapes, pointedly ignoring him. Maz bit back a sigh and traveled, ending up in the antechamber outside the suite of rooms that belonged to the Angel of Death. Samael had disabled any teleportation that he didn't control within his own suite, so anyone who tried bounced into the antechamber where a handful of guards and one crotchety old female demon assistant waited to greet them. Do you have an appointment? The demoness grumbled in a voice like gravel. I do not, Maz admitted, then followed her motion to a small armless stool along the far wall. There were several scattered there, each as uncomfortable as the other. The vampire balanced himself on the wobbly stool, wondering that the thing held his weight, and kept his eyes on the assistant. She slowly paged her way through a demon romance magazine, its glossy pages full of colorful and torrid spreads featuring heaving bosoms and masculine abs. Maz knew that Samael enjoyed making people wait to see him, wanting them to feel his importance in their uncomfortability and receding patience. As the minutes stretched on, the vampire stared at the demoness, willing her to look up at him. She did, her eyes narrowing, and Maz knew then that she was on to him. His vampiric powers extended to persuasion, but he used it rarely, knowing that most people didn't take kindly to someone taking control of their will. But in an emergency, he was known to use his vampiric persuasion to move things along when needed. Come to me, he thought to her, and the demoness stood up, her eyes locked on his. She strutted toward him, primping her sagging breast and wiggling her senior hips as she came. Stopping in front of him, she waited breathlessly for his next mental command. Samael is waiting to see me. Quite urgently, in fact. Perhaps you can show me in, else our master might think you were trying to keep me all for yourself. He winked at her, and the demoness simpered. Of course, she told him, returning the wink, then running her hand along his arm. Let my horns point the way, big boy. He repressed his revulsion at the necessary flirting and stood, following the demoness and her horns through the archway that led into Samael's space. His guide floated down the corridor, making sure to swing her hips wildly in doing so, even looking back over her shoulder to blow a kiss at him as they walked. Finally, she reached a door. He expected her to swing it open, but instead she spun around, putting her back against it and lifting her arms to wrap them around his neck. I get off in a couple hours. What say we go to my place? I'll make you a meal, she said, making a point of sweeping her curls off her shoulder and revealing a stretch of bare throat to him. Afterwards, we can see what happens. A charming offer, he told her, gently extracting himself from her grip. But I'm afraid Samael has me on assignment. Another time, perhaps. He maneuvered her out of his way, then gave her a gentle pat on the behind to send her back in the other direction. Until we meet again, he said, waving at her. The demoness tittered her way back to her desk, fanning herself as she went. When she'd finally disappeared, Maz took a deep breath and opened the door. The vampire found himself in what appeared to be an office of sorts. Besides the chains hanging from the walls and various other torture implements, there were sturdy pieces of furniture, shelves lined with tomes and scrolls, and a massive desk in the middle of the room. Samael sat behind the desk, staring out the large window in front of him. His feet were up, resting on the empty surface of the desk, his hands behind his head. You took your time getting here, Samael said, without looking in Maz's direction. I want your assurance that no harm will come to Hollie. This statement earned a glance from his master. Removing his feet from the desk, he swiveled his chair to face the vampire. I gave my vow, or have you forgotten already? This isn't an unbreakable vow, one which I know you're even now plotting how to get around. This is a promise made to a loyal servant, one that should truly be unbreakable if you value me and the things I've done for you at all. If I value you, Samael shook his head, chiding Maz, you are the closest thing to a son that I have. I raised you into the man you are, gave you everything you have, granted you privileges envied by every other being in this realm. Then you should have left me and my mate alone. Maz knew he risked angering the Archon, but there was no way he could hold back the torrent of emotion inside him. Samael, however, kept his cool without incident. He rose from the chair to approach Maz. Putting a hand on the vampire's shoulder, he made intense eye contact. I know that it may appear otherwise, but I only want what is best for you, what's best for everyone. I could have left you alone with your mate, but it wouldn't have been long before Neveroil would have found you, and you've already seen what she's like. Bringing you back to Pluto is for your own safety and the humans. You've never done anything that wasn't for your own benefit, Maz told him. I won't pretend that you don't have an interest here. You plan to use Hollie as some pawn against your sister. So I will beg you not to. Please, don't embroil my mate in your machinations." Samael shook his head, a look of sorrow on his handsome features. "Is this what it comes to? Favoring some human floozy over the man who has treated you as his son? Who has given you the keys to his kingdom and could give you so much more? All over a mate who is more fragile than glass?" "She is no floozy," Maz answered, barely keeping a rein on his temper. "She is my mate. You know what that means." His voice took on a guttural quality, and Maz knew it wouldn't be long before the prince lashed out. "I'm the cursed one, remember? Fated to lose my mate and walk alone through eternity, and all it has taught me is that matehood is a useless fallacy. You will end up alone, and worse off for the pain of believing elsewise." "I'm sorry that happened to you. I can't imagine the agony you must have experienced, which is why I don't understand why you would willingly put others through the same pain. You could protect her without using her. Could grant us the freedom we crave, please." "It sounds like you still haven't learned," Samael replied, his tone disappointed. "The Prince of Darkness knows better," he said, waving his hand in Maz's direction. "And because of your lack of faith in me, you have earned a punishment. For your disobedience, you will no longer have the ability to travel at will. Now leave me and think about what you've done." Without warning, Maz found himself in the corridor outside the office. He grabbed the doorknob, attempting to let himself back in, but when he touched the knob, it disappeared, along with the rest of the door. "Damn it," he muttered, then watched as every other door in the hall disappeared as well. Remembering what his master had said, Maz attempted to teleport to his quarters, but nothing happened. Telling himself it was due to the prohibition against teleporting in Samael's suite, he hurried back to the waiting room, where the demoness rose to greet him. He dismissed her with a wave, then tried to teleport again. Nothing happened. Bursting into the hallway, he cursed under his breath as he turned in the direction of his quarters. Maz knew this was but the first of many indignities they would suffer at Samael's hands. "I've got to find a way to get us off of Pluto and away from Samael and his siblings for good." His protective instincts were going into overdrive, his nails turning into claws unbidden. He shoved his hands into his pockets and came across an object there. Pulling it out, Maz realized it was the mirror Samael had given him. He looked into it, and for a second, he thought he saw a tinge of red before it disappeared. Letting out an angry growl, he threw the mirror to the floor and stepped on it, feeling good when it crunched under his boot. "I want nothing that he's touched because I cannot trust Samael at all." It was a hard lesson, but one he could no longer deny. I must trust in myself and my mate, if my mate ever accepts me. At this point, Maz wasn't certain she ever would. Chapter 6. "This place looks like a Halloween whorehouse," Hollie grumbled as she looked around. Maz had left a moment ago after revealing that she was basically his prisoner, and she was looking for any distraction from the wound that was growing inside her. "I won't let him keep hurting me," she told herself. "Keeping things from me, trying to control me. Aren't those all textbook toxic traits of a bad boyfriend? I think Maz could do with an introduction to a little thread called Am I the A-hole? Let the internet tell him all the mistakes he's making." She grabbed one of the drapes and attempted to pull it open, but there were no pulleys or strings that did so. Hollie swept it to the side, realizing that beneath it was nothing but black stone. She hustled around the room, checking the other drapes before discovering the chamber was windowless. Great! Yet another escape plan finished before it even started. Giving up, she fell into a plush velvet chair the color of blood. "Now what?" she asked out loud, more to herself than to her companions.
"I've been accessing records about the realm, and I'm afraid the outlook is rather bleak. Samael is known to rule Pluto absolutely, and his power here is beyond anything in this realm and many others. If anyone tries to enter the realm, he's alerted immediately, and his host of demons are thought to be able to handle any security threat beyond Shayatin himself."
"Great," Hollie muttered. "Now tell me the bad news." Wendy beeped in confusion, not getting her Wisconsin sense of humor, but her father set up a loud laugh. "Yeah, Wendy, things have got to be worse than that. Let me guess. Samael only serves frozen microwave dinners for food, and ice cream doesn't exist in this realm?"
"Ice cream?"
Lights flashed in Wendy's dome.
"I'm afraid my records don't extend to the food served in Pluto, but if I were to hazard a guess, I would assume that it would be a basic demonic diet of grubs and...
Did you hear that, sweetheart? Grubs. This place can't be all bad if they've got milk to go with my grub cereal. Do they have milk, Wendy? The corners of her mouth were twitching at her father's jokes, but the bot didn't realize Frank was kidding around.
I believe demons to be lactose intolerant. Philemon the 14th postulated that dairy could be the cause of the sulphurous stink that sometimes accompanies a demonic visit, but that was debunked in the 18th rule of sarcoma when it was proved that the sulfur could actually be attributed to...
We should take Wendy to our next trivia night, Frank interrupted. Does Hastings Pub still host theirs on Thursday nights? Wendy's diatribe on dairy continued unabated at the same time.
The decay of certain molecules when they come into interaction with a reagent that is excreted through the demon's skin as a side effect of their teleportation abilities. Raphael the Wise is said to theorize that goat milk was actually more digestible by demons because of their relationship to the four-legged horned mammals, but he was never able to prove scientifically that... Remember that time Patsy had been overserved and kept shouting out 3 Dog Night for every one of her team's members until her husband dragged her out of the pub because the rest of the team was getting upset? Then he slipped on that patch of ice in the parking lot and Patsy fell down on top of him. We all had a good laugh that night, didn't we, sweetheart? Guys,
Hollie said, holding both her temples as they began to throb. If you want me to understand anything you're saying, you're going to have to take turns talking. She stood again, trying to walk off the headache that was starting to form, but she didn't have far to go and ended up circling the bed, round and round as her agitation grew. She felt trapped, forgotten, used. It might all be in the name of her safety, but Hollie felt like she had no control over her life anymore. It had been that way for too long now, and she was getting dang tired of it. I need a way out. Now. There must be some way we can let my friends know what happened to me, she said, thinking out loud. If we can get a message to the Fae realm, maybe they can manage some sort of prisoner swap or something. Hollie knew she'd sent her friends away to keep them safe from the coming storm, but she realized that without them, she had nothing. She was stuck here in a world dominated by controlling men. I could use some strong, independent sisters to save my bacon yet again. It wasn't just that the walls were closing in on her, but she was beginning to worry about the vow she'd sworn with Samael. She was certain Wendy had done all he could to create an airtight promise, but the Fae would have greater knowledge of what that vow entailed. And what happens if I break it? It was selfish, and it could embroil her friends in danger again, but she was desperate enough to try. But how could she let them know about Samael, Pluto, and her vow? Stopping suddenly, she turned back to where Wendy and Frank were discussing the meaning of trivia on Earth. Sorry to interrupt, but I have a question for you, Wendy. Do you know of any way we could contact my friends in the Fae realm? The usual flash of lights blinked on and off in his dome before he spoke.
Although I am equipped with a long-range communications array, it is generally not advised for us between realms. It would be too easy to overextend my power matrix by attempting realm-to-realm transmissions. In other words, you'd fry your circuits if you tried to broadcast beyond this realm? Hollie could feel all hope fading. I have heard rumors of other bots tapping into their backup power supply to boost the signal while simultaneously rerouting their amplifying subroutines in order to transmit messages from realm to realm, but I have never attempted such an operation myself. It could prove fatal. It sounds like you're saying it's technically possible, though, Frank piped up. I may not be an expert, but I did used to fiddle with a ham radio back in my teenage years. I might be able to make a few suggestions on how to boost your signal. Hollie listened to them debate the issue, having nothing to contribute. She started to slowly pace again, the thoughts she was trying to avoid streaming back in as she walked. Why does every choice I make seem to lead to an even worse outcome? Is that why Maz has refused to trust my judgment? Did he know that coming here would be damning us to a lifetime of misery under Samael's thumb? At the time, there had seemed to be no other options. She'd experienced torture at the hands of Nebroel already, and she wasn't eager to go up against the princess with a grudge against her any time soon. Nor did she want to see the insides of Aramon's collection and become another animal in his menagerie. Samael had seemed the safest option.
but Maz had fought hard against it, hard enough that he was close to dying by his master's own hands. Seeing him in a heap on the floor, throwing up that vicious black substance, his entire body heaving, she'd realized that they wouldn't be able to overpower the Archon. That only left outsmarting him. But how did a run-of-the-mill human outwit an immortal being who'd seen more things in his long, long life than she had ever dreamt possible? Therefore, she'd chosen to buy some time, to see if there would be another way of finding safety. Looks like I'll have an eternity to work on the problem, she thought wryly. That could work, she heard her father shout with enthusiasm. I say we give it a shot.
There is still a non-zero probability that performing such an operation would result in a frying of my circuits, as your daughter called it earlier, and I feel inclined to remind you that my circuits are also your circuits now. If we've made a mistake with our calculations or attempt to hold the gain for too long, we could suffer a fatal malfunction.
Hollie didn't like the sound of that. We don't have to risk life and limb, guys, at least not yet. We can try to think of other options. Besides, I suppose there's a chance this Samael guy might detect our signal anyway, since we'd have to blast it right out in the open. If he's got any tech that monitors communication wavelengths, we'd be caught in a second.
My scans have not detected any technology of any sort in the entirety of this realm, save ourselves, Wendy pointed out. Pluto is a magic-only realm, one of a multitude in the web. It's likely they don't have the aptitude to intercept a signal like the one we would be producing. There may be no one here to catch us.
Interesting, Frank said, and Hollie got a vision of her father, as he used to be back in Wisconsin, scratching his beard while lost in thought. I'm back to wanting to give this thing a try, he said, excitement filling his tone. If you show any signs of overheating, we'll shut down right away out of an abundance of caution. Hollie bit her lip, unsure how she was feeling about the idea. I don't know, guys. It sounds like Wendy isn't comfortable with the risk, and I would hate to lose you both. She didn't know how she'd stand the loss, if she was being honest with herself. But the opportunity to get the word out, especially right away, was a huge thing to walk away from. Wendy spoke after a moment.
In life, there is always risk. Conditions might be ideal now to make the attempt, as we are currently alone and can remain unobserved. If we are going to risk sending a transmission, now may be the best chance we get.
Hollie moved to where the bot was standing and went down to her knees. She took one of his small white hands in hers and looked into his translucent dome. Wendy, I know we haven't known each other long, but I already consider you one of my closest friends. I trust your judgment, above my own even. If you feel that risk is acceptable, then I'll support the decision. But if it's too much, please tell me. I don't want to lose my newest bestie. Pink lights bloomed in his dome.
I believe the risk is acceptable, and I consider you a friend as well, bestie.
She grinned, filled with gratitude at meeting the little robot. Taking his other hand, she spoke again. And Dad, I know you're rattling around in this modified gumball machine somewhere. The same goes for you. I know that you get excited about new projects, like the time you tried to fix the dishwasher. But let's remember that while you know a lot of things, you're not an expert at everything. Or we'll end up with worse than a floor full of suds this time. Her father chuckled, pink lights firing again. You're right, Cupcake, and I'm scared to lose you again, too, but Wendy and I can handle it. Okay, she said, wrapping her arms around the bot and squeezing him tightly. It looks like we're going to do this thing. The only door in the room suddenly swung open. Hollie's heart dropped, wondering if their only chance had just missed its chance. Chapter 7. What thing? The vampire's voice echoed against the stone walls of his chamber. Maz took a few steps inside, his face twisted up in a grimace. What thing are you about to do? Hollie let out a groan. Back already? How'd your little tete-a-tete with Samael go? Are you bosom buddies once again? Hardly. Maz relaxed his stance, giving the room a quick once-over. The scan put Hollie on edge. What did he think, we'd wrecked the place in the time he was gone? Maybe we should have. Too bad, she sniffed. And what did he say about giving me access to the door? Does he have some sort of key I can use, and one for Wendy, too? She saw the vampire's features tense and her throat tightened. That is, it didn't come up, and I'm afraid I forgot. It didn't come up. Hollie stood, bristling with anger. Or you didn't bring it up? Her fist landed on her hips as she tore into him. You didn't want to bring it up, did you? You didn't bother because your mate doesn't deserve any autonomy, does she? This is just like when you were stalking me from realm to realm. You haven't changed a bit. Slow down, Dumpling, Maz said defensively, holding up his hands. It was an oversight on my part, and not at all on purpose. In fact, Samael tossed me out of his office without giving me a real chance to discuss things. And to make matters worse, he took away my ability to travel, so we won't be able to teleport off this world if we did decide to risk breaking your vow. You can't teleport anymore? It was a heavy blow, one that made her sick to her stomach. Hollie would have been ashamed to admit that she'd considered using her fledgling powers of seduction on the vampire to convince him to take them away from Pluto. It had only been an idea, and not even a serious one, considering her flirting abilities were worse than a middle school boy's, but the fact that the option was now gone stung. She sat down heavily, not sure how she was feeling. Her emotions were a seething morass inside her, and the vampire's reappearance wasn't helping. He began pacing as she had earlier, muttering about loyalty meaning nothing to the worst sort. His foul mood radiated from him, and Hollie wouldn't have been surprised if he'd suddenly sprouted spikes. Remembering how his rage had led to his attacks on Samael not long ago, she worried that he'd lash out once again. And although Samael had vowed not to intentionally hurt the vampire, Hollie was not certain that would cover self-defense. She needed to refocus his attention, to calm him down somehow. She could go to him, climb into his arms, speaking to him gently and soothing him like a wife would her husband. It was a quaint image, but with the way she was feeling, an impossible one. Resentment still rode her, and she couldn't fake the kind of emotion needed to act in that intimate way. We've had an idea, she said, her tone casual. What if we reach out to friends, let them know what's become of us, and find out what our options for aid might be? He paused, his expression dark. You mean the Fae? I do. She steepled her fingers, her indexes resting in front of her chin. Just hear me out. The way I figure it, Phaedra isn't going to let things go without investigating things on her own. She's just not the type to quit. So if we let her know we're safe, she'll be able to relax a little. Phaedra relaxed, he scoffed. That will be the day. At her non-committal shrug, he continued, Surely you don't expect me to believe you just want to send a message that we're all safe and sound. Just a quick and friendly call from one of the 17 hells? Don't worry about us, love. We're settling in just fine. His mocking tone riled her, but she forced herself to remain calm. She believed I made friends with a vampire, Hollie replied flippantly. So this shouldn't be too big of a stretch. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment she felt a prick of guilt at the way she was treating him. But then she reminded herself that Maz had earned it. Look, she said, hoping to break through their petty back and forth. I do not want to let them know what happened to us, but I also think they might be able to help. Is that why you sent them away on Nyx? Because I thought you were clear then that no one could help, even your Fae friends. Nyx was a no-win situation, and you know that. She couldn't hold her temper in check any longer. They were injured, could have died if they stayed any longer. Retreat was the best option then. It still is, he told her. You're wasting your time reaching out to the Fae. Phaedra might be a wild card, but the rest of them are anything but. The Fae don't want to involve themselves in a war with the Princes of Darkness. They know better. It's a fight they can't win. I have faith in my friends, she insisted. They've been underestimated before, but not once have they let me down, which is more than I can say about... She stopped herself from finishing the sentence, so he finished it for her. Me? More than you can say about me? He shook his head. It doesn't matter how hard I try. You'll always pick your friends over me. There was real hurt in his eyes then, and the guilt that had only pricked at her before now stabbed her through the middle. She stood up and went to him, putting a hand on his arm. Maz, I'm grateful for all that you've done for me. Now that we've put the misunderstanding of our initial meetings behind us, and I might be mad at the way you've behaved, but right now we need to act like a team, or we're going to end up making this a whole lot worse than it already is. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Putting his hand over hers, he took it and brought it to his lips. A truce it is. Does that mean we're going to try the transmission? The question came from her father. The vampire turned to the robot and frowned. It was a moment before he responded. Say we reach the Fae. What do we tell them? He scratched his temple, thinking it over. The danger of the Fae sending in aid to Pluto is astronomical. Not only will they be defeated before getting anywhere close to us, but Samael will take it as an invasion, an act of war that will have to be answered. Maybe they don't need to come to Pluto. Maybe we can get to them somehow. Hollie's brow furrowed as she thought it over. She had no idea how to escape the keep, let alone the realm, however. Maybe it would be just enough to tell them what's going on, how Samael is planning to use me as leverage against his sister, how she's supposedly going to set into action the prophecy that the Fae Queen's own brother had perverted to be about her. I think Elspeth might want to know that little bit of information. She might, Maz agreed. He took a seat at last on the edge of his bed near the bot. You think you'll be able to get a message to the Fae realm?
I cannot say for certain, Wendy admitted. There is a possibility we might be able to reach the Fae. There is also a possibility that I might suffer a fatal malfunction.
Fatal, eh? The vampire seemed to turn that fact over in his mind. You are worried that trying might be the end of you. I guess it's an act of faith for all of us, Frank said, taking over the conversation. But I believe it's worth the risk if it helps get Hollie out of the pickle you've helped to put her in. Hollie cringed at the edge in her father's voice, but Maz didn't contradict him. Instead, he nodded his head again. For my part, I can tell you that an existence on Pluto, no matter how long, would not be a very happy existence for your kind. This realm is a miserable place, a cruel place, and no place for a robot or a human woman. She felt his gaze find hers, and the warmth that bloomed in her chest annoyed her. No matter how dangerous he was, how much he might annoy her or anger her, he was still a man who was too attractive for his own good. How does he have the power to do that with just a glance? Then we try it, Frank said. Right, Wendy?
Affirmative,
the bot replied. Okay, Hollie said, rubbing her suddenly clammy palms against her dress. So, how do we start? The robot rolled to where she sat. A compartment opened in his side, and out came a thin metal arm, holding what looked like a flat white circle.
Please place the receptor in the center of your forehead. This will allow me to access your mental projections in order to narrow in on the target location.
Hollie plucked the disc from the bot's hand and placed it in the center of her forehead, where it remained affixed somehow. It felt a little cool against her skin, but she didn't experience any discomfort.
Now what? Now you think about where we're going to send the message. Visualize as best you can exactly where you want the message to land.
Wendy's dome flashed with colorful lights as he waited for Hollie to get to work. She closed her eyes, picturing the Fae realm as she remembered it. She spent some time there after helping to rescue Gilly from Valencia. It was a peaceful realm, full of tall trees and rolling hills. The capital city of Ixaria came to mind, and Hollie pictured herself floating above it, looking down on its shining structures. Good, her father said. But we need to be more specific. We can't very well shout out across the entire city. Right, Hollie murmured, focusing her attention on the palace. Her vision zoomed forward until she was floating just above it. Better, her father said, and this time it sounded as if through gritted teeth. She heard a low buzz coming from the robot, and she opened her eyes out of concern.
No!
This came from both Wendy and her father at the same time, along with a series of pops that sounded bad.
You must keep your focus, the robot warned. If you lose it again, we might not be able to get it back.
Quickly closing her eyes, Hollie brought her thoughts back to the palace. She recalled her time there, walking its hallways, sweeping through her suite of rooms, and trying not to feel lonely and out of place. Focus! Frank warned, his words slurring like a record being played too slowly. Hollie concentrated harder, thinking about the part of her day she'd enjoyed the best. Breakfast in the great hall, its tall windows letting in the golden sunlight, toast and jams and sweetbreads, Taylor laughing with me and Phaedra in the corner complaining.
That's it,
Mindy said, his voice sounding higher than usual.
Almost there.
The smell of scorched electronics reached her nose, but she blocked it out. The cream-filled pastries that melted on my tongue, the hot chocolate that appeared in front of me whenever I felt down and in need of comfort. She could hear a fizzle, then a series of pops, each louder than the last. Finally, when she was about to open her eyes and tell the robot to stop, her father let out a jubilant cry. "We've got them!" Chapter 8. A very confused Taylor stared down at them, her pointed ears twitching.
"Hollie, is that you?"
A grin broke out on her face.
"You're alive and seemingly well, thank goodness." "Taylor!"
Hollie let out a breath she was holding and cried out with joy. The wavering image hovered just in front of the robot, the Fae's smiling face flickering slightly, like a television channel with imperfect reception. Beyond Taylor, she could see the rising dome of the breakfast room, and Hollie realized that their transmission must have appeared on the surface of the table.
"Where are you?"
the Fae asked, squinting to take in the red velvet drapes behind Hollie.
"Did you make it back to your home realm?"
"Unfortunately not." Hollie's eyes flashed to Maz, who was watching her with a neutral expression. She considered telling Taylor the full story, that the vampire had taken them to his pocket realm because he thought they'd be safe there, but she hesitated. Maz had told her he'd never shared the location or even the realm's existence with anyone else, and she wanted him to be able to preserve that privacy, even if it didn't extend to his master.
"We managed to get away from Nyx, but Samael tracked us down soon after. Now we're trapped on Pluto and looking for a way to escape," she said after a pause.
"Pluto?" Taylor's nose wrinkled in disgust.
"I've heard that's the worst of all the 17 hells. How are you faring?"
"So far, I haven't seen anything beyond Samael's keep. We wanted to get a message out as soon as we had the chance."
This means your vampire's still with you."
The question was asked in a casual tone, but Hollie knew that relations between the Fae and Maz's kind were anything but casual. Still, Taylor had been supportive of their connection in the past, unlike other members of her race. Hollie nodded in reply.
"I would have never made it off Nyx without him."
She thought she saw Maz stand a little taller at her comment.
"How is Cass? Is she still with you in the Fae realm?"
Taylor shook her head.
"She's back on Samothrace, summoned by the Witches' Council to report on her activities."
The Fae's face scrunched up.
"How are you managing to send this message? Did you find a magic user on Pluto who is helping you do it?"
The Fae looked intrigued by that prospect.
"It isn't magic," Hollie confessed. "It's the little bot who's stuck by my side since Belafonte. His abilities could give any magic user a run for his money."
As if to contradict her, Wendy let out a high-pitched whine, and Hollie caught another whiff of smoke.
"Even so,"
she said, hoping to hide her sheepish expression,
"I'm not sure how much time we have, and I was hoping to pass a message on to the Fae Royals themselves." "Of course," Taylor said, nodding. "Let me alert them."
Hollie watched as she signaled one of the palace staff and expressed the urgency of the situation.
"They should be here pretty quickly,"
she said, then leaned in and cocked her head.
"Tell me, as a human who has been away from her home realm for some time now, are you experiencing more or less home illness?"
"Sickness," Hollie corrected. Holding in a sigh, she told herself to be patient. Taylor considered herself to be an expert on human studies, as she called it, and often asked awkward or annoying questions. Her gaze sought Maz again, and she forced herself to look away.
"That's hard to say. Right now, I'd give anything just to be in charge of my own destiny." "Is that Hollie I hear?"
A familiar voice rang out across the hall, and a moment later Phaedra appeared, shoving her face close to the makeshift screen.
"Hollie, where are you? How did you survive the last battle?"
"Hi, Phaedra," Hollie said, wanting to groan.
"I'm still alive and kicking, all thanks to Maz. If he hadn't managed to distract the Darkness family, we would have never escaped Nyx."
The Fae warrior frowned at the mention of the vampire's name.
"Where are you now?"
she asked, her eyes scanning the screen. Hollie opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, more Fae arrived in the view of the screen.
"We're so relieved you're okay,"
said Lena, her identical twin sister Gilly nodding by her side.
"We thought the worst had happened."
Gilly grinned grimly. "We'd even started planning a memorial service for you," she said, then let out an oof when her sister elbowed her in her side. Hollie saw Phaedra roll her eyes.
"Don't give up your planning too soon. She's still insisting on involving herself with the leech. He's the reason she's even in this mess to begin with."
Biting her lip, Hollie carefully avoided looking in Maz's direction. She knew that when she divulged her location, she'd only get it worse from Phaedra. Still, she pressed on, knowing they didn't have forever. We made it off of Nyx, but it was close, and unfortunately, Samael caught up with us pretty quickly. In order to prevent any further bloodshed, she said, glossing over the fight between Maz and the Archon in the pocket dimension, I agreed to accept Samael's protection on Pluto. Her words set the Fae to talking over each other. What do you mean, agreed? It was Phaedra's voice that cut through the noise. How could anyone agree to the protection of the Angel of Death? There weren't many options, Hollie said, a little defensive. It was the most expedient option, and I did what I could to make sure he couldn't twist the agreement in some way. Wendy helped me make the most airtight vow we could. Vow? Phaedra said, while Hollie saw the color drain from Taylor's face. You made a vow to Samael, and he to me. He can't harm me or Maz in any way, and once his protection is no longer needed, he will release me. An unbreakable vow with the Prince of Darkness? Taylor's face went even paler, and she shook her head. This may be the worst thing to have happened since you left your home realm. Her voice was sad, almost pitying, and a chill went through Hollie. What do you mean? She didn't understand and stressed again that they'd carefully crafted the vow itself. Samael isn't going to be able to get around his promise, is he? I would put nothing past the fiend, Phaedra replied. But I'm more worried about what you vowed exactly. What's wrong? Lena asked, confused. She'd lived among the Fae her entire life, but a manipulation intended to break up her parents and feed on their realm had meant a very different childhood than most Faes. What makes the vow so unbreakable? Magic. If one of the parties breaks the vow, there can be horrible repercussions. Phaedra's expression belied her agitation. So horrible that most beings refuse to swear an unbreakable oath. In fact, the most I know about oath-breakers come from stories we're told as children. They're meant to scare us into keeping our word, and for the longest time, I thought they were just fables, but I know now they are not. You know an oath-breaker? This came from Maz, who moved into view. Even at my advanced age, I've never come across someone who has broken an unbreakable vow. Phaedra scowled at him, clearly not pleased to be reminded of his existence. I find that hard to believe, considering the hells you're known to inhabit. What happened to the Oathbreaker? Hollie interrupted. Was there some sort of punishment for breaking the vow? I should say so, although I'm afraid I never learned exactly what it was. By the time I stumbled across him, the Oathbreaker was wandering the rough, completely out of his mind. He spoke to spirits that no one could see, interspersed with howls of madness. Fear crept up her spine. Hollie felt Maz take her hand, but she didn't acknowledge it. So, don't break the vow. Got it. You still haven't told us exactly what you vowed, Lena reminded her. Even if a vow is unbreakable, it doesn't mean it can't be bent. I can't remember exactly. Wendy might. She turned her attention to the bot, and that's when she realized he was making a noise like a chugging train. Except he's a little tied up right now. She vowed to accompany Samael until such a time when she was no longer in danger from his sister Nevroel. Maz's tone said that he hadn't exactly been excited about the vow either. The Fae looked at each other, and Hollie could tell they weren't pleased. We're going to have to think on this, Lena piped up, and perhaps consult those older and wiser than us, but we will work on a solution. You mentioned Nevroel. I assume you've already pieced together her part in the prophecy of the Great Annihilation. When she nodded, Gilly continued. She's the one who's supposed to start the war against Shaitan, a war that will likely rock the entire web. And if what Phaedra and Taylor have told us is true, it looks like you're caught in the middle of it all. It's a misunderstanding, Hollie insisted, but Gilly waved a hand to cut her off. It doesn't matter. The point is, it's critical that you get away from Samael. If there was a war against Shaitan in the works, you can bet the Princes of Darkness will be front and center, throwing punches with the rest of the demons. And the mysterious princess, Phaedra added. She might be the one to lead the charge against her creator, but that doesn't make her an ally. She's just as dangerous as the others, if not more. You don't have to remind me, Hollie said, repressing a shiver at the thought of the torture she had undergone at Nev's hands. If you have any ideas of how to get us off of Pluto while also not breaking the vow, I'm all ears. Phaedra jerked her chin in the direction of the vampire. Why not have the leech bring you off-world? Provided we can find a way around your vow. That won't work, Hollie confessed. Samael has taken away his ability to teleport. 4 groans went up from the other side of the screen. Drop him, Phaedra said, dead serious. At least when he could travel, he was useful. Now he's just a drain on you. Literally. She tapped the side of her neck to emphasize a point. Maz stiffened at Hollie's side, and guilt pricked at her. Let's focus on being constructive. Any ideas of other ways to get away from Pluto and Samael?
A demon seems like the easiest option, Taylor volunteered.
Find one willing to risk going against his boss and have him bring you here. And the vow? Can I risk breaking it, or will I be dooming myself to madness? Hollie felt like they were going in circles, but just sharing her struggles with her friends helped reduce some of her anxiety. Don't risk it, Phaedra said. Wait for us to mount a rescue mission. If we kidnap you, technically you won't be the one breaking the vow.
I'm not so sure about that,
Taylor mumbled, her expression anxious. A mission to Pluto? Lena's eyes were wide. That would be quite a feat, Gilly added. Getting to Pluto without alerting Samael and his minions, then stealing his current prized possession? That's a tall order. Phaedra opened her mouth to respond, but her words were drowned out by the sound of metal grinding against metal. Something's gone wrong, sweetheart, came from the bot in the semblance of her father's voice, as if he were 10 fathoms deep in the ocean. The sound grew louder, and then there was a loud bang, and suddenly a stream of acrid black smoke was pouring from the bot's dome. The screen vanished, and Windy let out one more shriek before falling over and lying still. Chapter 9. No! Hollie clambered over to the bot on her knees, picking him up gently and holding him to her chest. Dad? Windy, are you okay? The little metal robot remained motionless and unresponsive. Smoke still billowed from him, and she had to waft it away from herself, coughing heavily. Her heart was beating hard enough to sound like a bass drum in her ears. She stood, turning in agitation to Maz. I need a cloth doused in cool water. Get one for me. Maz sipped to the corner of the room and tapped on a panel there to reveal a small washroom. Returning with the wet cloth, he handed it to Hollie. The bot was gently placed on the bed, and she leaned over it, patting gently at the smoking dome. There was no sign of the lights that usually blinked inside his little round head. Please come back to me. Hollie. Maz's voice was low and urgent. He placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing gently. She shook it off, turning around to hiss at him like an angry cat. Don't touch me! Turning back to the bed, she focused on the bot, tears starting to stream down her face. Please, Daddy. Windy, please be okay. Her voice shook, and she sniffed, then wiped at the tears. Losing her father the first time had been devastating, but to lose him now, after just barely getting him back, might be worse. She needed people who loved and supported her, now more than ever. Perhaps I can. Stop! Maz froze in mid-motion, his hand extended toward the bed and the bot in it. Don't pretend like you can help them, or are vampires secretly tech wizards and the world doesn't know it? Maz's arm dropped back to his side, and he looked at her, a calm expression on his face. The wrinkles around his eyes and the clenching of his hands into fists at his side let her know that calm was a farce. She ignored the regret she felt at reacting so hostilely, but she wasn't in the position to get a hold on her temper now. All she could think about was that she might have just caused 2 people she cared about deeply to die while trying to help her. It's all my fault. The smoke dissipated, but the bot remained still. Its casing was still warm, and she could see tiny fractures in his red metal body. I shouldn't have tried the transmission. I should have listened when Windy warned us about the risk. She was drowning in guilt, the emotion twisting up her insides, weighing down her mind. Patting gently at the bot with the cloth, she kept begging in her mind over and over. Please, please let them be okay. Please, if they're not okay, I don't think I'll ever be okay again. Please. Hollie. This time Maz's voice had some steel in it, enough to make her turn around and face him. This is not your fault. Both your father and Windy wanted to try too, so you will not blame yourself. I won't, huh? You're telling me this isn't my fault? This is not your fault, he said with a tone of finality. He moved around her to sit on the bed beside the bot, being careful not to jostle it. He took one of her hands and placed it on his chest. Like me, those 2 would do anything, sacrifice anything, to ensure your safety. You're saying they sacrificed themselves for me? That thought made the tears worse, and Hollie bit back a sob. I don't want anyone to give their lives for mine. You don't get to choose. His tone held a certainty that would brook no resistance. "It is our choice to put everything on the line for you, because you are the most precious thing in the multiverse to us." He put a hand on her cheek, his thumb wiping away tears. "Our choice," he said again, softer. "And you can believe me when I say that there is no regret in making that choice." His words broke her. Sobs racked her body, and Maz stood, gathering her into his arms. He gently stroked her hair, holding her close and letting her cry. It unlocked a torrent inside her, all of her fears, her regrets, the pain she'd experienced, all of it poured out as he held her. Hollie wasn't sure how long passed before she finally stepped out of the ring of his arms, but she felt a little steadier. She still held on to her anger at the vampire for keeping information from her, but she managed to get a hold on some of her grief. "So," she started, hoping to distract her from the deactivated bot on the bed, "what do you think about Phaedra's rescue plan?" He was silent for a moment, choosing his words. "Your friends are brave, I will give them that. But they are not familiar with what they might face on Pluto. They might have glimpsed Samael's power on Nyx, but they have no idea how much worse it would be if they attempted to invade the realm he built." "The Fae aren't exactly helpless themselves," she reminded him. "Remember that acorn the Fae Queen provided? That packed a punch big enough to knock out 3 big baddies. I'm not saying your friends are powerless. On the contrary, I must admit that they have impressed me greatly. I'm merely suggesting it might be wise to seek out alternate options." "You're saying not to put all my eggs in the Fae basket?" His brows crept up. "I'm afraid I don't understand. I didn't mention a basket. Is that some sort of spell or—" A smile flickered across her face. "Just an expression. It means don't pin all your hopes on something that might fall through." Maz nodded. "Exactly. It would be wise to find another way out of this mess, another way off Pluto that didn't rely on outsiders." "And the vow?" she asked, her grin disappearing quicker than a heat mirage on a highway. "The one we can't break without risking madness or worse?" He ran his hands through his hair, not comfortable with the question. "I warned you about the vow, if you remember. That it wasn't a good idea." "But you didn't exactly explain why. You seem to have a habit of leaving out crucial pieces of information, don't you?" He picked up on the anger in her tone, but she wasn't sure if he understood the hurt beneath it. "I know that you feel you cannot trust me, but I swear to you, I would never do anything to hurt you, and I will always try to protect you. Protecting me doesn't mean keeping me in a bubble like a child. You can't leave out vital information." She let out an annoyed huff and began pacing again. "My life has been out of control since you entered it, and you withholding things from me just makes it worse. I need to feel like I can trust you, that you aren't trying to control me like your master and everyone else." "I know how you feel," he said after a moment. "The loss of control, it has happened to me as well. The moment I caught sight of you—" She paused, turning to look at him, caught by the emotion in his voice. He was tense, but there was an openness in his face that made her believe him. "The mating bond, it's one of the strongest instincts a being can experience. This biological drive to claim, to join yourself with your perfect match, it's nearly uncontrollable." Mention of the mating bond, like always, made Hollie uncomfortable. She'd fought the notion that the two of them were meant to be, but with all they'd been through, she was beginning to think there might be something to the notion. Still, she didn't like the idea that Maz was driven to be with her because of instinct, not because of her attributes or who she was. Somehow he seemed to sense her disquiet. The vampire came to her side, taking her hand and staring down into her eyes. "I know how this may seem, that things are outside our control, that circumstances and the mating bond are calling all the shots. I won't argue that it is easy to chalk things up as choices we didn't make, but let me make one thing clear to you. I want to be with you because of who you are, not because we are mates." Hollie shook her head and opened her mouth to contradict him, but he put a finger to her lips and continued. "We are mates because we are perfect for each other, because who we are complements one another. If that wasn't true, then the bond would not be possible." She stared up at him, his words hitting like fat raindrops on a tin roof. "What are you saying?" "No force can control the way I feel about you. I love you, Hollie. I love your smile, your sense of humor. I love the way you value your friends and try to defend them. I love the way you never give up. No matter the adversity you face, I love you because you're you." She could feel the tears welling again, but she blinked them away. Breathing heavily, Hollie wasn't sure how to respond. No man had ever said those words to her before, not romantically, and it was a lot to take, especially from the handsome, hulking vampire. She could feel herself softening, wanting to return the emotions, but she was afraid of what would happen if she did. Maz stared at her for a moment, then turned away. She thought she noticed a glimpse of hurt in his face, but if it had been there, it quickly vanished. "If we want to reclaim control, we need to find a way off of Pluto and away from Samael and the rest of his cursed family." "But the vow?" "We'll deal with that risk when we get there." "And Nev? She's still out there, waiting to pounce. The whole reason for coming here was to be protected from her and the other princes." Hollie failed to add that she'd also made the decision after watching Samael mop the floor with the vamp. "If we strike out on our own without the Fae or other allies to have our back, what's to say she doesn't snatch us up again?" "And if we stay here, you think we'll be safe?" Maz shook his head. "Samael is waiting for his chance to use you, but trust me, as soon as he does, he'll discard you, and no vow will stop him from doing whatever he wants." Hollie threw up her hands in frustration. "We go. Nev captures and tortures us, maybe kills us. We stay, and Samael uses us, maybe kills us. It's an impossible situation." "There's no certainty that Nev Royal will capture us, but I know from experience how my master operates." His words were sharp, his gestures agitated. Hollie wondered what had happened during his little discussion with Samael. "You're not safe here." "And where exactly am I safe?" Her temper exploded, leaving her feeling raw. "Not on Earth, where you stalked me until I fell into the arms of an imp with a grudge and a plan. Not in any of the other hell realms, for sure. And now the place where at least we know we have a modicum of protection, you're telling me isn't an option either, despite being the lesser evil?" "Lesser evil," Maz scoffed. "There is no such thing, especially with Samael." "Then what about my friends? The Fae have kept me safe up until now. They've fought on my side, only wanting the best for me." "We can't wait on the Fae." "Why not? Because of your aversion to the race, or to my friends in particular?" Maz scowled. "Your friends are the ones with an aversion to me. You use them as a weapon against me at every opportunity. Are they the only ones whose judgment you trust?" Hollie knew he was talking about himself, but she chose to hear it another way. She looked past him toward the bot on the bed, who still lay lifeless. "I should have trusted Wendy's judgment," she told herself. "My judgment is what led us here. If anyone isn't to be trusted, it's me." Sadness consumed her, and she sat on the bed beside the bot, her hand going to his metal frame. She no longer wanted to continue the conversation, tired of talking in circles. Hollie was tired, beyond exhausted, and her emotions were too real, too close to the surface. "Maybe if I lie down and sleep, when I wake up, all of this will have been a dream." "Hollie, I know you trust your friends, but—" "Enough," she said, holding up a hand, her head hanging wearily. "I don't want to argue any more. I need space, quiet, peace, and I'm not going to get it with you here ranting at me. So take a walk and give me what I need." Maz stared hard at her. She could tell he wanted to respond, but he held his tongue. Turning on his heel, he walked to the door, opened it, and walked through. She stared at the space he'd been for several long moments before leaning back onto the mattress and closing her eyes. Letting the tears flow, she let her grief devour her. Chapter 10. His steps were directionless, their sounds echoing off the stone walls of the keep. The thoughts in his mind also lacked direction, tumbling at random into the forefront of his consciousness. Being separated from Hollie caused a dull ache to radiate from his chest, and he wanted to turn around and return to her side, the pull getting stronger with every step. "Son of a devil spawn! I can't seem to win with this woman. Over and over again, I've tried to show her what she means to me, so she will know that I would sacrifice anything, risk anything to protect her. But it seems I still haven't earned her trust. When will she finally let me in?" He rounded a corner, paying no mind to where he was heading. And then there are her friends. Maz had developed a grudging respect for the Fae, and he was grateful for the aid they'd given to his mate. But it wounded his pride to know that Hollie always called on her friends, first and foremost. He was starting to feel like an afterthought in comparison. He'd known the process of convincing his mate that they were meant to be wasn't going to be easy, but at this point, it felt like 2 steps forward, 1 back. Frustrated anger forged by jealousy of Hollie's closeness with the Faes vibrated through his muscles, and Maz had the sudden urge to rend flesh from bone, to give in to the mindless hate that he'd only recently put behind him. It was hard to deny his vampiric instincts, but his instinct as a mate overrode all else. The vampire caught a whiff of something foul, pulling his thoughts to the present. The sound of bodies gathered together, speaking casually, entered his mind a moment later. His senses told him they were about 100 feet away, and he headed in that direction, glad for the distraction from his own dark thoughts. An archway framed the entrance to a large chamber half filled with demons. They stood around, chatting and posturing, obviously waiting for something. It was from this group that the odor was coming, sharp and earthy. Maz snuck in, keeping to the shadows, interested to see who was behind the gathering. He didn't have to wait too long. From a door that was hidden in the rock face, Tubo emerged, his head that of a ferocious tiger, his body that of a hyper-masculine male. He let out a roar, pulling the attention of the demon horde. When all eyes were upon him, Tubo stared down the crowd. "All right, you foul-smelling maggots! You all know why you're here. You've been pulled off sanitation duty, a duty which you all earned for failing to live up to expectations. You want a chance to prove yourself to the boss, prove that you're worth the horns on your head. You want a chance to wash the stink of filth off your rotten carcasses? Then you're in luck, because this is your chance." Maz cocked an eyebrow, wondering where the shifter's spiel was going. "You're the advanced force," Tubo continued. "And your job is to not be seen, to not be heard, and to not be detected. You'll be given your orders by my lieutenants, and you're to keep those orders secret, even from the other wastrels gathered in this room. If even a peep of this gets out, it's your hide that Samael will be using as a decorative rug. Understood?" There were several murmurs and a few sarcastic remarks sprinkled among the crowd.
You want us to believe Samael is sending us on some secret mission, and it's somehow going to get up off the shit-shoveling detail?
Tubo nodded with a grin that exposed long, feline fangs. "That's correct. Do this job, and you'll be promoted into the SOs." This comment caused a mini uproar among the demons. Several stood straighter, their attention now laser-focused on the shifter. It was clear to Maz that Tubo enjoyed having them all in the palm of his hand. The shifter paced in front of the first rank, seeming to imagine an SO uniform on his own lanky frame. On Pluto, SO stood for Supreme Overlords. They were Samael's personal enforcers, their uniforms the deep red color of freshly spilled blood with crisp black and white accents, with a small skull on the right sleeve. Every demon minion aspired to a place on the SO squad, but very few were chosen, which made Maz wonder what exactly this secret mission was setting out to do. He listened as Tubo answered questions, but the shifter was careful not to reveal anything about the mission itself. The half-tiger, half-man emphasized that this was an opportunity, and if the demons were successful, the prior poor performance would be redeemed and they'd be set up for life. Maz was skeptical of the shifter's promises, especially considering the ragtag smelly bunch he was addressing. Samael is not sending his finest, he thought, which made him think the mission would result in these former sanitation workers being promoted to cannon fodder. Not sure that's much of an upgrade. The horde finally ran out of questions, and Tubo dismissed them, letting them know to await further contact. The room began to empty, although a small cluster of demons lingered around the tiger shifter, pushing for more information. He was good-natured in his response at first, but he soon grew annoyed at explaining that he couldn't provide further details, an annoyed roar finally scattering the remaining lurkers. Tubo turned to exit through the same hidden door, but before he reached the locking mechanism, Maz floated out of the shadows to confront him. The shifter jumped and whirled around at the tap on his shoulder, his claws and fangs exposed and ready to do damage. "Put those away, Kitty," Maz chastised him, and he watched as the shifter's face became more human-like for an instant, broadcasting the creature's nervousness. "Maz," he said with an anxious laugh, "I didn't expect to run into you here. I thought you were still chasing after the imp." "That's so," Maz said, his eyes glued to the shifter's face. I would have thought the Warden of Hell would have been informed that the boss has bigger things to worry about than Dallin and his nonsense, especially given the so-called secret mission. An anxious chuckle came from the shifter at Maz's air quotes. That's nothing, really. Just a lark with the sanitation boys. A lark, huh? Maz leaned in, his eyes flashing coldly. He let out a little trickle of his vampiric persuasion, in no mood to take the time and shift through Tubo's lies. Tell me what this secret mission entails. Tubo's eyes widened, but he managed to shake off the hint of compulsion. It's nothing, really. You know how Samael is. Always eager to punish. Those guys are just low-level screw-ups, so we figured we'd have some fun. Am I going to have to use a sword to cut through your lies? Maz hissed, his hands coming up, fingers turning to claws. Or should I cut through you myself? He asked the question again, this time putting the full force of his supernatural persuasion into effect. They're being sent as an advance contingent to strategic locations around the web to watch and wait for any sign of Nevroel's appearance. Tubo's words were quick and efficient, but the expression on his face said that he wasn't happy about sharing these details. Samael knows that it's just a matter of time before more realms than those belonging to the princes will get pulled into the growing conflict, and he wants to make sure he's well positioned before the prophecy comes to fruition. Samael is planning for the apocalypse, then, Maz said with a nod. It made sense. The most strategic of the princes, Samael always had multiple plans in play at a given time. Something as important as the Great Annihilation would mean plans within plans within plans. Why isn't he tracking down his sister instead of setting up these outposts? Doesn't she represent the real danger? According to the prophecy, the prodigal daughter's return would set in motion the end of all things evil in the web. Maz thought that was a bit far-fetched, given how tough it was to entirely root out all the bad things in the multiverse. But if he were Shayton, he might be a little worried about what might be at hand. Tubo shrugged. Maybe he is. I don't know. But I don't think it's his sister that Samael is really concerned about. And what is he concerned about? In Maz's estimation, the Angel of Death's number one priority would be discovering where his long-lost sister was and what she was up to. Or maybe it's just my priority, since that infernal woman means my mate harm. What his sister brings with her? Tubo's eyes got shiny, and he let out a laugh. The boss man is Team Apocalypse, baby. He's ready to watch it all burn, as long as he has a front row seat. The vampire's eyes narrowed. Could what the shifter was saying be true? You're telling me that Samael wants the apocalypse to happen. Isn't he worried about being on the chopping block along with the rest of Shaitan's servants? Very little worries Samael, Tubo countered. All he sees is opportunity. With the granddaddy of all evil gone, there's going to be a power vacuum at the top. If Samael plays his cards right, he could end up with the entire web under his thumb. Maz suppressed a chill at those words. He almost couldn't believe the shifter, but something inside him told him it wasn't as far-fetched as he would have liked to believe. Shayton had created the Princes of Darkness and imbued them with their fantastical powers. Betraying the adversary of old would mean suffering on an unimaginable scale if caught. Samael is running a huge risk, the vampire thought. The Angel of Death was positioning himself not only against his creator, but potentially against the rest of his brothers whose powers were as strong as his own. No wonder he's so worried about keeping things secret. You're probably wondering why the boss entrusted me with this task and not you, Tubo said, a little cockiness entering his tone. It's probably because you're tied up in something else, aren't you? Or should I say someone else? I heard we have a human presence in the keep now. When will you be introducing me to your mate? Flashing fangs, Maz unleashed the temper he'd been holding in for too long. Never speak of my mate again, or I will rip the tongue out of your mouth. Turning his vampiric compulsion on full blast, he stared into the shifter's eyes. You will not tell anyone that you saw me today, nor that we had this conversation. You will forget everything you have told me, and once you leave this chamber, you will have no member of this exchange. Tubo's eyes were wide and glassy, his mouth hanging open. The shifter gave a nod, then watched as Maz activated the locking mechanism of the hidden door. It opened, and Maz gave the tiger a shove inside, then closed the door behind him. He heard footsteps on the other side of the rock face as the shifter walked away. his memory instantly absent of anything having to do with Maz and what had just transpired. The vampire stood there pondering the exchange. The information he'd just gathered could be near priceless to the right party. If Samael was planning to switch sides or to sabotage Shayatin's defenses against the impending apocalypse, there were several powerful beings who would likely want to know that, and they might even pay a pretty penny. Even Shayatin himself would be interested, although Maz couldn't picture himself sharing anything with the center of evil in the multiverse. Shayatin was a creature of myth and legend, and he'd prefer to keep away from the creature he'd only heard about spoken in nightmarish terms. The princes, however, seemed more approachable. Like Samael, they weren't easily trusted, but at least they'd be easier to deal with than their creator. And let's not forget, a princess is now in play as well, one that seems very interested in her brother's actions. A plan started to unfold in Maz's mind, and he began to see a way out for them. It would be difficult, perhaps the hardest thing he'd ever done, but it was the first glimpse of light at the end of this tunnel that he'd caught. The vow says that Samael has to release Hollie once she is no longer in danger from Nev Royale. If Nev lost interest in my mate, and she and her brothers could keep Samael busy, we might have a chance to escape. Perhaps for good. A grin had just started to form on his face when emotion poured over him like a jet of icy water. Hollie! Something was wrong. She was inundated with sadness, a level of grief he'd rarely glimpsed. I must find her, protect her, comfort her. He barreled from the chamber, heading to his personal quarters, vowing to destroy whatever had made his mate cry. Chapter 11. The sound of beeping drew Hollie back to consciousness, and her eyes blinked open in search of an alarm clock. Her memory returned a second later, and she realized that the source of the noise wasn't an alarm, but the bot by her side. Windy is working again? She clambered swiftly to her feet and leaned over the bot, watching as a series of lights flashed in his dome in time to the beeps. You're alive! She cried excitedly, hovering over him and waiting for a response.
I am,
he said after a moment, his little hands taking hold of the corner of the bed to maneuver himself off of it. He stood, his dome revolving slowly as he reacquainted himself with his surroundings.
I was forced to reboot all of my systems simultaneously and purge any harmful subroutines.
His speech was littered with pauses, which Hollie assumed were his systems still booting back up. Her struggles with her own laptop told her that sometimes it took a little time to come back online after a hard shutdown. I'm so relieved, she said, pulling the bot into a loose hug. I was certain that transmission was the end of you. I'm so sorry I asked you to do that. I should have listened to you when you outlined the risks.
Hollie, I don't think you understand.
The bot's tone was urgent.
I had to purge some subroutines, and I think in my weakened state, I neglected to account for the shade of your father's location within my neural net. And, well, I can no longer sense Frank's presence.
Hollie froze, then slowly backed away from the robot.
What are you saying? My father is gone?
Dark purple lights flashed in Windy's dome.
I'm sorry, but I believe so. It was a foolish mistake, and I offer my most heartfelt apology. Dad?
Hollie's voice broke on a sob, and she fell to her knees in front of the bot.
Dad, are you there?
Refusing to give up hope, she thought that maybe his shade had left the robot's body and was inhabiting the room with her. She continued to call out for him, her faith diminishing at the lack of response.
No!
She howled, feeling worse than she had since her father's original demise.
Dad, you can't leave me, not now, so soon after I found you again. Please come back.
Sobs shook her small frame, and she covered her face, trying to block out the reality of the loss. There was a slam of wood against stone and a rush of air that hit her an instant before the feel of strong arms wrapping her up in an embrace. It took a moment to realize that Maz was holding her, so deep was she awash in emotion. Shh, he said, gently stroking her hair. Calm down, Dumpling. You're all right.
I'm not all right, she contradicted him. I'll never be all right again.
Her grief turned to anger, and she pushed him away.
How did you know I was upset?
She asked, wiping at her tears.
Were you lurking outside the door, listening to my every move?
No. he said stiffly. I was not outside the door. Then how did you know? She asked, wiping her nose on her sleeve. Do you have some kind of monitoring device in here? Hidden cameras to keep tabs on your victims? Maz frowned. How little you think of me. He looked from Hollie to Wendy, then gave a nod at the robot. It is good to see that you're back. Is that what has set her off crying?
I'm afraid I lost her father,
Wendy said in a morose tone. Maz's eyes widened and he looked back at her. That explains what I felt, he said softly, then blinked, an exposed expression on his features. He blinked then quickly, but not quickly enough for Hollie not to catch it. What do you mean? What did you feel? She asked, alarmed. A long sigh came from the vampire. He settled onto the bed, bending his elbows to rest on his knees and running both hands through his hair. I could sense that you were upset, and I rushed back here to see what had happened. You could sense it? How? Maz met her gaze with a look of sincerity. When you shared your blood with me, it allowed me to sense your location, but it also gave me the ability to sense your feelings as well. Sense my feelings? Hollie felt her stomach drop. You mean you could tell I was sad even though you weren't in the same room with me? She watched him nod and her insides knotted. What aren't you telling me? Explain. It's the blood bond. There are benefits that go beyond what I have told you. I can tell where you are, what you're feeling. He paused, then looked away. And whether you're thinking about me. What? She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Feeling like she was tied to a pendulum, her mood swung fully from sadness to rage. You have got to be the most toxic male I've ever met in my life. Hollie, I know that you're upset, but... Oh, no, she interrupted, holding a finger up and wagging it in his face. You don't get to talk your way out of this one. I can't believe you did this to me again. I must be the stupidest human ever to think that a vampire could change his fangs. I wanted to tell you, he insisted, to show you, actually. The blood bond works both ways. We aren't doing anything, she told him. Never again. There is no we. There's an idiot who will never trust again, she said, touching her chest. Then she pointed her finger at him. And there's a liar. Let me show you, he said, his tone agitated. You insist that I'm doing things behind your back, that I'm trying to control you, but that isn't my intention. My entire existence has been focused on another, on his needs, his desires. It was only in the last few centuries that I realized following blindly behind someone who pretended to care wasn't fulfilling. It was a waste of effort. But it wasn't until you came along that I came to understand what fulfillment was. But until we both experience it, it's not what it should be. Don't you see that's what you've been doing to me? Leading me along, making me follow you blindly, and it's all a waste of time. You've been trying to convince me of this story you've told yourself, that I'm your perfect mate, but you haven't given me a choice in any of this. It's not a story, he told her, scowling. It's real, and if you just complete the bond, you would know beyond a doubt that you are my mate, and I am yours. Oh, I already know the answer to that, buddy. Hollie pushed past him to the door, reaching for the handle to open it. But nothing happened when she touched it, and she let out a groan. I can't even kick you out properly because you insist on keeping me locked in here. Maz approached her, his brow furrowed. Listen to me, Hollie. I know you're upset. Get out, she said, cutting him off again. We aren't rehashing the same argument. We aren't mates. We're two people stuck in a ridiculous situation. We might have bonded over our shared trauma, but that doesn't mean a relationship between us would survive longer than a weekend. So get out, because there's no way in however many hells you people have that I'm going to share a room with you. Out. He looked at her, and something flashed behind his eyes. He opened his mouth and paused. Shutting it again, the vampire shook his head. He put his hand on the knob, and the door opened. Walking through, he turned back, an unreadable expression on his face. You can run from what you don't want to hear for only so long, he said in a measured tone. Sometime, you're going to have to face whatever fear you have of being happy, of being loved. And when you finally do, I'll be there waiting. Hollie watched him turn his back again and set off down the corridor. The door shut on its own, and as it did, she could feel the tears start to roll down her cheeks once again. She turned away, heading back to the bed to tumble into it, face down. Her face was hot, her head aching, the weight of several worlds on her back. She'd managed to risk her friend's life, lose her father, and now she'd driven away the only friend she had in the realm. Her despair overcame her, and she poured it all out, all of her fear, her pain, her disappointment. A few moments into her crying jag, she felt a small hand on her back.
"Are you okay?"
Wendy asked, then pressed a silk handkerchief into her hand.
"I found it in a drawer. I thought it might be useful."
"Thanks," she said, taking the handkerchief and blotting her face. "I don't know what I'd do without you."
"At least you don't have to worry about that. My protocol prevents me from leaving your side."
Hollie blinked at him, about to start up the waterworks again until the bot raised his hands palm up and shook them back and forth. "Wait, Wendy, did you just make a joke?" A cascade of lights went off in his dome.
"Was it not funny? I'm afraid my humor subroutines might be out of date."
She laughed, and it unlocked some of the tightness inside her. She hugged the bot again. "Thanks. I needed that." Running her hands through her hair, Hollie tried to look at her current situation with a clear head. "I'm trapped in this room, helpless to help myself. I can't ask Wendy to send another transmission because it almost killed him last time, and I won't think about Dad now. And if I wait here for the Fae to figure out how to topple one of the most powerful beings in the multiverse, I might go mad. I'm out of options," she groaned. "We are trapped here, and there's nothing I can do about it." She fell back against the mattress again. "Maybe I deserve it. My choices are what led to this."
"No one deserves this,"
Wendy said.
"and we may have only known each other for a short time, but as you've said before, we're friends, and friends don't let friends give up."
She turned to him. "What can we do, Wendy? Everything is stacked against us."
"There are always options."
Hollie shook her head. "Sounds like your optimism drive is out of whack." She heard something that approximated a chuckle come from the bot.
"I do not have an optimism drive. My personality subroutines are set for a balance of positivity and negativity, with the slightest bias in favor of the positive, but there are no errors currently in that area. What I meant was, we're both intelligent creatures with enough initiative and creativity to defeat any obstacle."
"Intelligent?" Hollie scoffed. "If the folks back in Watoma heard you, they'd laugh themselves into stitches."
"Anyone who underestimates you is a fool," Wendy replied. "So let's put our heads together and figure out a way off Pluto."
Hollie sat up again. "How can we get off Pluto when we can't even get out of this room?"
"I've been thinking about that," Wendy replied. "And I think I may have a way to override the locking mechanism on the door."
"You don't say," Hollie said, the spark of hope kindling in her chest once again. "I guess it wouldn't hurt to try." Wendy let out a whistle of excitement, then rolled across the floor toward the door. Hollie wiped away the remaining tears from her face and took a deep breath. "If that little guy won't give up after almost frying his little bot brain, then I won't quit either." Chapter 12. "I wish I had a credit card," Hollie said with a groan. "I figured out how to jimmy open the lock to my dad's den when I was 7. He used to lock the Halloween candy in his desk and dole it out to me one at a time, and one year I was over it. I saw someone use a credit card on a movie once and spent about an hour figuring out how to use it to pop open the den door one Sunday when my father was taking a nap."
"I'm not certain what a credit card is," Wendy admitted. "But if it's anything like designed to emulate the complex frequency modulations the locking mechanism runs on, I wish I had one now, too."
She was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall near the door. The bot was busy scanning the knob with a device that had come from inside his red metal body.
"I've got to find the exact frequency that the vampire vibrates at in order to unlock the mechanism."
"It's all about vibes with that one," she murmured, thinking again about what Maz had said before he left, about the mating bond. The certainty in his voice had shaken her, but she still clung to the idea that he was mistaken. "He says that matehood means my blood resonates with his, like singing in harmony."
Singing is a form of frequency modulation, if you think about it, Wendy said, his dome turning in her direction. That gives me an idea.
A hatch opened in his metal hull, and out came an apparatus that zipped toward Hollie. She flinched away, but Wendy told her it was harmless. She held still while it attached itself to her wrist at the pulse point.
If your frequency harmonizes with his, I might be able to narrow down the band if I... There!
The apparatus zipped away back into his body just as the door clicked and swung open.
It worked!
A burst of joy hit her, but it was tempered by a thread of unease. Does this mean that it's true? That our blood does vibrate in sync? Then maybe what he was saying isn't wrong? Hollie pushed the thoughts out of her mind. This wasn't the time to ruminate on matehood.
We pulled it off, but what do we do now? She asked, suddenly overwhelmed by the turn of events. Your Fae friend's idea made sense. We should find a demon and see if we can convince them to take us away from here.
The robot started rolling through the door, then paused when she didn't follow.
It's risky, she told him. And who in their right mind would agree to betray Samael on his own turf? We're talking about demons, Wendy pointed out. They are widely known as a capricious and opportunistic bunch, and their intelligence, on a whole, is lower than average among web races. If the offer is good enough, we should be able to persuade one of them to transport us to Bellefonte or the Fae realm.
She shook her head. I don't know. What if Samael figures out that we've popped this lock? We've got cushy digs now, but he could stick us somewhere worse, not to mention the whole unbreakable vow thing.
Risk and reward do not have an inverse relationship, Wendy said. The bigger the risk, the bigger the reward, which means we have to take a risk to get a reward.
His dome turned away from her, and the bot rolled into the hallway.
Let's go.
Hollie let out a deep breath. She knew the bot was right. He'd done his part and gotten the door open. Now she had to do her part. Still setting foot into the hallway outside of Maz's quarters was hard. The bot was silent as he rolled down the stone corridor, and Hollie crept behind him, her head turning this way and that, worrying at every step that she might be caught out by Samael or his minions. Her muscles were tense, her mind full of scenarios in which she was captured and tossed into a horrible dungeon with rats and roaches and horrible creatures intent on torturing her and the robot. It took several long moments before she started to relax. Wendy led the way, choosing corridors at random, or so it seemed, until another handful of minutes later they appeared at a door with a small window that displayed an outside courtyard.
You got us to an exit, she whispered, impressed. My navigational software is top-notch, he said quietly, then set about trying to open the door.
This one did not have a fancy lock, and soon they were heading out of the keep.
Samael must not be keeping too close a watch on us,
she told him as he led them out of the courtyard and into a narrow alley. Otherwise, how could we make it this far without alerting him?
There are two options, the bot replied. Either he believes the vampire is with you, or dogging your steps.
Or, the bot hesitated before replying.
Or he is watching you and is allowing you to think you're free when he can snatch you up at any moment.
Thanks for fueling my nightmares, she said sardonically. In the distance she could see a ring of ruins that seemed to circle the keep. So now what do we do?
We find ourselves a demon.
Easier said than done, she said as they walked down a street flanked by destroyed buildings covered in rubble. It doesn't look like anyone lives in this place. It's utterly trashed.
Agreed, Wendy said. But my scans indicate that there are signs of demon life about a mile in that direction.
He gestured with one little hand. Right, Hollie said, regaining some of her confidence. Now that we have a destination, what is our plan for singling out our demon rideshare?
I've been thinking about that. It would make sense to find a gathering of demons, preferably inebriated ones. They'll be more amenable, and we'll have a chance to try out our offer on multiple potential transporters.
Okay, we want a gang of drunk demons. Where do you think this world's Bourbon Street equivalent is?
I'm not sure what street you're referencing, but we're about 2 blocks from a large concentration of demons, and my scanner has picked up evidence of alcohol in the vicinity.
Wendy turned left on a street that looked to be in better shape than the ones they'd already been down. Conditions improved as they went, and by the time the street led out into a larger thoroughfare, the buildings were all intact. Hollie was surprised to see that the structures around them resembled a somewhat normal city, if a little gloomier and more ragged. It reminded her of the seedy part of Chicago they'd gone through once when her father made a wrong turn on the way home from the aquarium. "Look at that place over there," she said, jerking her chin at a storefront a few blocks down the street. There was a neon light flashing over the door in the shape of a curvy female with a spiked tail. "I bet they serve drinks in there."
Are you sure about this?
The bot asked as they approached. The iron door of the establishment burst open, and a demon stumbled out before doubling over and expelling the contents of his stomach, which seemed to be mostly liquid. Hollie watched where she stepped to avoid the growing puddle of puke. "You said drunk, and this guy definitely fits the bill." She leaned over, snapping her fingers in front of the demon to get his attention. "Excuse me, sir, but how would you like to help out a damsel in distress with a quick ride home?" The demon blinked up at her, no sign of comprehension in his expression.
I think this one might be too drunk, Wendy said.
"I think you're right," she replied, and gingerly stepped around the creature, who had returned to his busy schedule of upchucking. "Maybe we'll have better luck inside." Hollie pulled open the door, and a whiff of hot, musky air hit her. She held the door open for the robot, who activated his jets to hover near to her. She blinked into the dim confines, her eyes making out a horseshoe-shaped bar with dozens of patrons gathered around it. The bar wasn't just for serving drinks, but also acted as a stage for the 3 demonesses who were shaking their money-makers for tips. It was a crowded space, its floor sticky and littered with empty cups and other detritus. She picked her way forward, careful not to touch anything or anyone. The patronage of the bar looked rougher than she was used to. Watoma's too small for a grungy club like this, and the one emo kid from high school moved to Portland to become a mime, so I'm totally out of my element. It didn't take long for them to get noticed. At first, it was just a few long looks, and a couple chuckles in her direction, but by the time she'd approached the outer rim of people gathered around the bar, she was starting to get more than looks. A tall demon with a nose piercing and a mohawk came closer, lowering his head to sniff at her neck. Hollie flinched backward, and he flashed a crooked smile at her. "I smell human. You lost, little girl?" "Why, are you a tour guide?" She flashed him a flirty smile. "I could be," he said, taking her hand and pulling her closer. "The first stop on our tour, my bedroom." "What about my place instead?" she purred, wrapping an arm around her neck. "If you could give us a lift, I'm sure I could find a way to reward you." Hollie had no intention of following up on her promise with actual carnal contact with the demon, figuring once she got to her destination, she could give him the slip with Wendy's help. But if I have to flirt to get off Pluto, consider me Miss Casanova. "Sounds like an adventure," he said with a wink. "Just tell me where we're headed." Hollie's insides exploded with excitement. "I can't believe this is actually working." "You can take me to—" "Oh, hells no, Ronzi!" came a female voice 1 second before a shapely leg inserted itself between Hollie and the demon. "You are messing around with humans now! How disgusting!" The leg belonged to one of the dancers up on the bar, and it was covered in a knee-high black stiletto-heeled boot. 1 second the leg was between them, and the next, the demoness appeared in front of Hollie and gave her a shove backward. "Get out of here, skin bag! Ronzi is my man!" "Whoopsie!" Hollie said, holding up her hands in surrender. "My mistake." She backed away from the demoness, heading around to the other side of the bar to put some distance between them. But it seemed the sharks circling the bar had caught the scent of blood in the water. A trio of grinning demons in black leather turned in her direction, ignoring the dancer they'd been tipping out with silver coins a moment ago.
I must admit, I haven't had a taste of human in some time, the middle one said, giving her an appreciative glance. "What say we take this party somewhere else?" he suggested, elbowing his buddies. "You look like a girl who enjoys a good time."
"I am," Hollie said, flirting back, but feeling a little more vulnerable now that it was 3 against 1. "Although I'm not a fan of crowds. You and I could get to know each other better, though." The middle demon took a step forward, his smile widening, but before he got far, the demon beside him grabbed his arm.
"I saw her first,"
he insisted, tugging his friend back while launching himself forward. "No reason to fight over me," Hollie said, biting her lip. But the demons ignored her and continued to argue among themselves. So far, the plan wasn't going so well, but she wasn't about to give up. How about we find someplace quieter to discuss? Her words were lost to a racket that burst suddenly from the makeshift stage. The sound of shattering glass drew her attention, and Hollie saw one of the remaining dancing demonesses kicking glasses off the bar as she stomped in their direction. "You!" she said, pointing at Hollie. "You're distracting the crowd. I want you out of here."
"It's a free country," the middle demon yelled back. "Don't get jealous. It's not a good look on you."
"Damien, you piece of garbage. That's the last time I put up with your cheapness. Silver, really?" The demoness leapt from the bar and onto the complaining demon's back, digging her fingernails into his shoulders. Hollie tumbled backwards straight into another scantily clad demoness who was carrying a tray of drinks. They spilled everywhere, and the waitress tossed her tray to the ground in a rage.
"You're going to pay for that,"
she said, hitting her fist into her open hand. She lunged for Hollie, and the human female readied herself to take her first punch.